I like to start with the big picture, and this for me is the big picture. This is the dual stream model as David Poeppel and I first conceptualized it in 2000. And basically the idea here, we were interested in how speech is processed perceptually. And there were lots of problems concerning conflicting data and so on. And we came up with this model that basically has auditory systems bilaterally processing initial acoustic phonetic signals. And then speech could be processed in two different streams from that point on, depending on the task, depending on what you were doing with it. If you were going to comprehend speech like normal speech is processed, like you're doing now, there's a ventral pathway involving posterior temporal lobe areas that connect up to semantic areas. That's what these arrows point to nebulously. Ventral, down. Down, yeah, belly technically, but in humans, our necks are crooked, so ventral is down for us. So that's the sound to meaning pathway. And then there's a dorsal pathway, so that means up or back, like the dorsal fin. And that involves inferior parietal temporal region that interfaces with motor articulatory system. And if you think about it, there's two things you need to do with sensory information in general or speech in particular. You need to understand what the words are. You need to understand the message, but you also need to be able to produce speech, that is, take speech and reproduce it with your own vocal tract. So that's what these two pathways are doing. Okay, so that was in 2000. Yeah.
If you were speaking or talking with somebody with sign language and all that, will this diagram all completely useless?
No, it's very useful.
There's no auditory.
There's no auditory, but it's coming in visual. It's going ventral. So yeah. Let me back up a little bit and show you where this came from. The idea for this dual stream model came from evolutionary thinking. So the basic idea was that speech evolves on the basis of existing cognitive and computational systems in the brain. We were already a pretty sophisticated primate by the time language evolved. And it had all the systems we certainly see in the great apes, non-human apes. And it had an organization that was studied in the visual domain. And this is a model, a dual stream model of visual perception. That involves the same two pathways. You have a ventral pathway, where you have the temporal lobe here, that's involved in recognizing, say, objects of what's in the environment, and you have a dorsal pathway that's involved in motor interaction with what you're seeing. And that is, I can recognize this as a computer, independent of any action I direct towards it, or I can take the shape and location and size and use it to direct actions for grasping and lifting and doing things like that. So this is this dual pathway, and the idea is that these things evolved out of some basic plan, architectural plan that was existing in the primate brain. It emerges in this way for vision. It emerges in this way for speech, but they're basically homologs, literally homologs in an evolutionary sense. So sign language would follow something a little closer to this, but the architecture is the same. This seems to be a basic plan for sensory systems. You have these two divisions. Okay, and you can see examples of deficits that are homolog. So you get an example in the visual domain where you have people who can recognize objects just fine, but if you ask them to reach for it, they kind of grope. They won't be able to reach effectively. Something's going wrong in the dorsal stream. Similarly, in language, you have a condition called conduction aphasia. And that's a syndrome where perception is fine, they can recognize words just fine, but they'll often be groping for the sound pattern of words. They'll say, trying to say a word like cookie, they'll say it's a coke, it's a cook, it's a coke, I don't know. And they'll just kind of grope for, just like groping with the hand. Once they make an error, they can detect it. So perceptually, they know what's going on, but they just can't link it to the motor system. And they're fluent, so there's nothing wrong with the basic motor plan. And they'll get stuck on a word and have trouble.
Sure.
Yes.
I have a question on this. First of all, I just realized who you are. I mean, that's amazing that you're here. Just amazing. This paper is amazing. Second question on that. Temporal. Does that conduction aphasia has a temporal thing where it's more difficult at the beginning to produce a word?
Not necessarily. It's more difficult with increased phonological load. So if you make a complicated word, and aphasia assessments that involve saying simple things like ball and whatever, but they also have people say stuff like Methodist Episcopal. That will cause lots of problems. Or non-words are almost impossible.
So it doesn't have the temporal dynamics of speech production.
Not in a simple sense.
What is it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Okay, let's see what I want to talk about next. Okay, so David and I had proposed this model and basically hypothesized by homology that a dorsal stream auditory motor integration area should exist. So it was well known in the monkey work and visual motor integration that this intraparietal sulcus region, this is a macaque brain, contains regions that seem to be doing visual motor transformation. That is taking visual features like shape and size and location and translating that representation into motor coordinate space so that you could generate a grasp that would be appropriate, say, for interacting with that object. These things live in here. There are multiple of them. They seem to be organized, at least in part, around motor effector systems. So you have one for grasping, you have one for saccadic eye movements, for example. They, if you measure them physiologically, they show both sensory and motor response properties. So you can record from a unit, present an object, and the unit will fire. Ask the monkey to reach for the object, even in the dark, so there's no visual input, the unit will fire, so you get the sensory motor response property. And if you do tracer studies, you find that they're densely connected to motor areas involved in controlling that effector. So grasping areas connect to F5, saccadic areas connect to the frontal IPs. Okay, so that all makes good sense. But we hadn't identified that same kind of region in speech. And so that's what's this hypothesis spurred essentially a decade of research in my lab trying to identify this circuit. And we used a paradigm that was kind of modeled on the property. So this was our initial paradigm. We had people listening to nonsense words. We wanted to drive the phonological load as much as possible. There were multisyllabic to make it harder, so we could, ramp up activity in that area. And this is fMRI, by the way, I should say. And then we had people silently rehearsing, imagining saying the phrase over, or the set of words over and over again for 27 seconds, so we could separate the bold signal to the perception and to the proxy for the motor task. A tone told them to stop, and then they rested for 18 seconds to let the signal come back to them. So we expected these three patterns in activity. So this is bold signal. We expected an auditory pattern, which looks like this green trace. So it ramps up during the presentation of the stimulus, but then falls back according to the hemodynamic response function to baseline. The tone triggered it to go up again. We expected a kind of motor weighted response. That is, it wouldn't respond robustly to the sound, but would ramp up during the rehearsal period and stay relatively active until the person stopped imagining the rehearsing. And then we expected, and what we were really interested in was this combined response, regions that showed response to the acoustic stimulation as well as a sustained response during the rehearsal period. Okay, the idea there was that any area that activates both shows sensory and motor response properties, like these intraparietal areas in the monkey's visual motor system, are good candidates. Doesn't prove anything, but they're good candidates for regions doing this kind of process. So this is what we identified. Green areas are ones that show this auditory response. It's an auditory cortex and a surprise. So this is our second paradigm we developed, which is you listen to speech, you rehearse it, and then you listen to the same speech again. So this is nice and symmetric, and then you rest. And you get this kind of camel hump pattern responding just to the acoustic stimulation. This is the response. This is this saddleback kind of response you get when you're identifying regions that respond both to the listening and rehearsing. So you can see the sustained response here during the silent rehearsal compared to the rest of them.
Okay, so rehearsing is not mine.
Rehearsing, it's not. It's just we did it just imagined. Okay. Yeah, no actual movement.
Okay, so many people when they're thinking about speaking, their lips kind of lips, but they don't produce speech.
Yeah.
So does it involve that process?
It's possible. Some people move their lips a little bit or their vocal tract a little bit. We've done this with overt movements, but just silent. So we've had people mouth the speech,
I see.
but without voicing it. The key thing, the reason why we needed to do this is because if we had people speak overtly, then they would hear themselves talking, and that would drive auditory cortex activation, and auditory cortex would look like. Okay, so those are the patterns, those are the distributions. I became obsessed with this area that we ended up calling SPT for Sylvian parietal temporal, but the secret is that in the lab, we kept seeing this spot activate in every single subject that we ran, and we ended up calling it the spot. When you look at a new subject, we were like, is the spot activated? Is the spot? Yeah, there's the spot again. So we kind of reverse engineered an acronym that made brain sense, but really is the spot. So SPT is the spot because it really means Sylvian parietal temporal in my mind. So that's the spot. I became obsessed with that because it looked like a decent candidate for the homologue of monkey visual motor integration areas in the intraparietal sulcus. So that was my auditory motor translation system. Yeah.
Is that bilateral?
Is it what?
Bilateral?
No, well, we do see it a little bit in the right in some people, but if you measure it, it's pretty strongly left on it. Yeah.
What does it mean?
Sorry?
What does it imply to be left dominant?
Well, speech production is pretty left dominant in general. So if you have damage in the left hemisphere, you're going to end up with speech production problems, aphasias. If you have,
It's speech perception.
no, that's bilateral. Yeah, people think that so at this word comprehension level, I might have some data later on. But basically, everyone thinks that speech recognition and perception is a left dominant thing, but you can remove the left temporal lobe and perceive speech quite well.
You'd be able to learn this which if the left is
Learn it to produce it again.
No, to recognize.
To recognize, yeah, with left hemisphere damage, recognizing speech is not a problem.
Learning and recognizing it. Would that
Learning new words?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know that it's been studied, but I don't see any reason why not. But relearning the production part doesn't happen. Aphasia is a stubborn chronic condition in the chronic state. Okay, so that's the pattern. Notice I got obsessed with SPT, but there's more red areas. It's a network. It's a sensory motor network. This is in the STS. We see that pretty regularly. It's a small spot, but we see that. And then you get two kind of premotor sites, essentially, that also show these patterns. So if this was before mirror neurons got really crazy, these sensory motor cells, but this, from a mirror neuron person's standpoint, is good evidence for activity of motor areas during perception, because it's activating during perception and production. I don't think it's mirror neuron. Well, I don't think mirror neurons are doing what they do. A student of mine, Brad Buxbaum, who was a co-discoverer of SPT, did a study later looking at connectivity. And you see essentially that SPT is kind of at the boundary in the temporal lobe and this dorsal stream zone. So you can identify lots of different divisions between these dorsal and ventral systems. SPT seems to be at that boundary. So in other words, it's connected to frontal motor speech areas. There's connectivity between SPT and frontal motor areas. And we did a study to look at motor effector selectivity. So remember I told you that regions in the intraparietal sulcus seem to be organized around motor effector. So that seems to be the organizing feature. So is SPT organized around a motor effector, namely the vocal tract? That's what we thought. So we had, what I didn't tell you here is that when we ran this study, this was the second study we ran, and we wanted to know if this sensory motor activity in this network was speech specific. So we had people listening to melodies and then humming them. I compared that to hearing speech and then reproducing it. And you can see the red and the black curves are speech and music. So you can see that they're essentially identical. The network activates just as well for both, which at first I thought it was a speech phonological related area, but then I thought, well, it's just vocal tract in general. It's not, it's about the vocal tract. It's whatever is controlling the vocal tract that matters. That's what this circuit is doing.
But humming melodies, not about vocal tract.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, technically vocal tract is supralaryngeal, but vocal tract plus larynx. Yeah, I'm being impersex. So given that it activates to music-related stimuli and humming, we recruited some pianists to do the task, either humming back the melodies or imagine playing the melodies. And we predicted that SPT activity wouldn't be as much during the playing because if, that is, SPT was motor effector selective. And that's what this curve shows. So this is humming and this is playing. We pre-tested them to make sure these are simple, like 2-measure melodies and skilled pianists could hear it and reproduce it without error. And you see you get this difference in SPT. So reverse pattern in parietal.
So I guess, sorry.
Now, is this blue curve correlated in any ways to expertise of pianists?
We just recruited all skilled pianists. We just wanted them to be able to perform the task well, and then just looked at the difference. So we didn't study expertise.
If you were taking a 2-year pianist versus a professional pianist?
I think, well, it'd be hard because I guess that a 2-year pianist could play back the melody reasonably well.
Yeah.
I would expect maybe an exaggeration of that difference. I think the skilled pianists, if you imagine playing, you can't help but hear it, and maybe you have some sensory motor thing going on at that level. So that might be why you still get this sustained activity in the play condition.
So I guess the take-home message to now is that the system is really what is about tones.
You're at my point in this stage of the research, which is in the 2000s, I was thinking speech tones, but you're ahead of me because
I'm sorry, I didn't.
No. You're ahead of me in the sense that you've already hit on the fact that maybe it's the tones that are more important. And in speech, there is, of course, a tonal part of it, that is prosody, which we're having people reproduce sentences, including the prosodic contour. So we'll come back to that. I think that this SPT area is not a unified zone. I think it is subdivided into regions, the preview, subdivided into regions that are involved in song-like processes versus other regions that are involved in supralaryngeal phonetic-like control. But it took me a long time to figure that out. You got it in a few minutes.
I read the papers.
Okay, good. So this is SPT. This is all of this was just to establish why I think SPT is doing something like this auditory motor integration. And we've done lots of studies that shows all of the features that you see in interparietal areas and so on. This is the location of it. It's deep in this on average. It's super hard to find sometimes because that part of the brain has highly varied individual anatomy. So sometimes if you average, it'll just wash out. But it tends to be in this zone right here, right at the back of the platinum temporalum.
What is that?
Why is what?
An explanation why it's located exactly there.
Well, yeah, sure. So auditory cortex is here. I don't think I have a slide that shows the cytoarchitectonics of this in this deck, but primary auditory cortex is here. Surrounding it is like secondary auditory cortex. And people often assume that the planum temporale, which is this structure back to the end of the Sylvian fissure, is also auditory cortex. And parts of it are, but as you get towards the back, it transitions to something that has been described as transitional cortex. It's definitely not primary auditory cortex. And in fact, it looks a lot like the cytoarchitectonics of this zone. So it has motor properties, interestingly. And it is kind of in the vicinity of dorsal stream, in other systems. It's in the general vicinity. So that's like why I think it ended up there. Okay, so this is the vocal homologue to the interparietal visual motor areas. All right. So I had done all this work on SPT and giving talks and stuff, and I would always say, oh, it's doing auditory motor translation. And people would say, well, what do you mean by that? Like computation, what's going on? And I said, I don't know. I'm just trying to make sure that we've got an area that's doing what we think it's doing. Let me work on that later. Whatever it's doing, my default was whatever it's doing for visual motor transformation, and people talked about coordinate transforms and stuff like that, it's doing the homologue of that for speech. So let's leave it at that. But then I started looking more closely at what it's doing computationally at a high level. Let me illustrate. Yeah, these are cobbled together slides, so I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but let's just go with it. All right, so name this instrument, someone. Ukulele, right? Okay, so the way that you produce that. You have a sound pattern that you've learned in the past, the name of the instrument, ukulele. And then you're able to reproduce that sound pattern. You learned it from hearing it, right? You heard the word, you coded that word somewhere, and now you can reproduce it, right? So what if I told you, I don't have a slide for that, but what if I told you that if you ask this guy, a local who in Hawaii, how to pronounce that instrument, it isn't ukulele, it is ukulele, okay? So now I've given you a new sound pattern, and I can ask you, now say that. Ukulele.
Ukulele.
Ukulele. Pretty good, pretty good. Maybe it's not perfect to the target that I'm giving you. So think about what's happening here. The sensory information that you're hearing serves as the target for the speech motor plan. And you're basically just hitting that target. I've given you a new target, and now you're aiming to hit that new target, okay? So we can think of speech production as, like all motor acts, as basically a code for, some sort of code for the sensory target of the action, and then a motor plan aiming to hit that target, okay? So I started looking at, because of this, I started looking at feedback control models and motor control in general to get some inspiration to try to understand what's going on with this SPT circuit. Again, reasoning from homology. It's unlikely in my mind that evolution would build a motor control system that isn't like what's already existing in the brain. The most natural thing that could happen is you have motor control for reaching and grasping and other functions. And maybe what happened was some gene duplication happened and you set up another circuit and similar architecture, and that eventually evolved into a speech control system. So that means that the architecture and the computational organization of that system should be homologous to what we see in visual motor control. And these are the kinds of models that you see with, this, for those of you who know motor control, this should be quite familiar. You have basically a plant, as it's called in motor engineering, the thing that you're trying to control. We're working on the vocal tract and larynx in this thinking. And then you have some control system. You can think of this as an M1 or some motor system. And then you have some feedback that comes through sensory systems that can then modify the plans. So the simplest is you generate a motor act, you detect the consequences of that, did it hit your target or not? If it didn't, then you can update your plans and try again next time.
Finish this.
Okay. So, but there's a problem with that in motor control. That external feedback only is too slow and noisy. And so to explain how we actually move, I'm not going to go into the details of that unless you want me to. But the solution, the engineering solution to this is an internal model. So basically what you do is, having made movements and detected their consequences multiple times, you can then learn the mapping between a movement plan and its consequences, and then predict it from the movement plan going this way. And that's called the forward model, and that allows you to predict the consequences ahead of time. And then when the signal comes in, you can match the prediction to the sensory consequences. Yeah.
So I have a question on the basic premise of this.
Yeah.
I can see how a human will hear some sound in the mind many years ago, and we try to reproduce them with their arms too much. Because that's kind of, you see the motion, you see your action. Now, speech is more abstract, so the target is a more abstract entity. How, it seems like there's a gap there.
Yeah, so that's what's different about thinking in speech, and I don't. The idea is this is the version of a basic architecture that I came up with to try to explain this, what was going on in speech. So let me just try to motivate that, and I think it'll answer that question. So basically, this, even though it doesn't really look like it, this is a standard psycholinguistic model. So if you're familiar with psycholinguistic models of speech production, they're usually three component. It's like you have a semantic system, and then you have a word level system, sometimes called a lemma. I'm combining those two into this box here. And then you have a phonological system. So it's a 3-layer thing. And those kinds of models do really well in explaining things like the error patterns and aphasia and so on. They're quite successful. but they don't have the sensory motor architecture. That's a completely different architecture to what the engineers say motor control is like. So what I wanted to do is to take the architecture from motor control engineering and see if it would work with a psycholinguistic model, basically to integrate them. So what I did is say, this is a phonological level. This isn't low-level motor control. Okay, this is high-level linguistics. Okay, it's phonological categories and so on. But I split it up into a motor control architecture where we have sensory systems that are coding the target. So what's happening when you're learning words is you're learning all these targets. You're learning what the sound pattern of the words in your language are. And then you learn this mapping, how to go from the sound motor plan that will hit that pattern, okay? And that's what forms the internal model. This thing is an internal model. Linguists would call it phonology. But I call it, it's still phonology, but it is the architecture of it is an internal model.
Do you think this forward model is learned through developmental year and then stay fixed as a rule we learn a new language, for instance, or is something that's updated? There's also new targets that we're experiencing.
Yeah, so certainly this is going to be really busy as kids are learning language, but it doesn't stop working for us in adulthood. And there's a few different ways that it doesn't. Does anyone pick up accents easily? Yeah. So what's happening? You're hearing new targets, and that's modifying your targets, which affects your motor plan. You start talking like what you're hearing. People thought I was Canadian for years because I went to grad school with a ton of Canadian, and it was 5 years or more before I lost the vowels. So that's what happened. You just learn to hear, and you can do experiments on this sort of thing.
But the interesting thing is some people are much better at picking up on accents and imitating them than others.
There is individual variability, I have no doubt, in this system.
And you think it's because of this forward model being more adaptive throughout age for some people than others?
Maybe, yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at variability, individual variability, the second language acquisition as a function of age, on average, you get worse in learning a second language, but there's a spread. And there's some people who are quite good and some people aren't. So similar kinds of things happening there. Yeah, in the back.
Yes. So in reaching, there's this view of planning to initiate optimal control. Is there a similar idea that you could apply here?
I think so. So people who work on speech motor control from a speech motor standpoint, like Frank Gunther and people who build models to do stuff, they would build that sort of thing in. And yes, I think there's some space for that. I don't know if it's going to be at the phonological level, how to implement something like that. I haven't thought in that level of grain. So like I said, I'm really kind of bird's eye view of this system, just looking at the basic architecture. But yeah, I would expect similar properties holding. Yeah.
The system suggests that you have multiple scales of learning, right? Something has to be fast, something has to be slow, some has to. This is not the same learning rate. The mapping between the sensing and the motor, that will differ motor translation. Are you aware if there are scales of learning, or is it different scales of integration, or there's only one, or see what I mean?
So
it did not work if the variables are all. The integration time is the same.
Yeah. I haven't solved any of those. I'd love to. I started with this because this is the basic thing I was interested in at the phonological level. But once you start thinking about language being organized according to an architecture like this, you think about other levels of language. So, this is a pretty high level phonological level. And you'll see in a second that I propose a lower level that is more kind of phonetic. Involving a different circuit. I'll show you what that is. And then I've gone to this system, the word level system, the morphological system, which from a linguist, I grew up as a linguist, essentially. It's weird to think of two lexicons, one input, one out, they're related to each other. Like, how is this working? But there's evidence for it. We've argued for that. So syntax, basically morphosyntax, has the same organization. Yeah.
But you argue that the reason you wanted the prediction is because if you were to rely on the external means is too slow.
Yeah.
I guess there is evidence that you need a faster time process to have the internal model.
Yeah, so that statement came from homology. So people studying motor reaching and rasping and saccadic eye movements, it's too slow to rely on feedback. That's external feedback. That's the kind of, well, you've all been or seen someone who is extremely intoxicated, and you get basically inability to make fine motor adjustments. So this test that you might get in a field sobriety test, that is a test of cerebellum function. Alcohol affects your cerebellum more extensively, so you lose this internal control at a lower level. And so that's kind of what it's like trying to rely on overt feedback alone and not have this internal model. You're kind of getting to near the target, and then you're like, well, so that's kind of what happens. So that is where it came from. And I just took the architecture. So the idea is that if that architecture applies at one level, it's going to apply at another level. So this was just kind of playing with models. Is this going to work, right? So let me just show you how it works. So the idea is that in the mature learned system, you have a bunch of sensory codes. That's your auditory-based targets. And it's a high-level auditory. They're phonological, but I call them auditory-based targets. You have learned motor plans for hitting those targets through sensory motor learning. And then you have this SPT, this translation thing that runs between them. So when we produce a word, I don't know if I have slides that show, yeah. So suppose we're trying to say the word cat. So at the lexical level, we selected the word that we want to produce, cat. And for reasons that I won't bother you with, I assume that it doesn't just go here and then like that. I assume that there's parallel pathways to both the motor side and the sensory side. You can ask me about why later. So that basically activates the auditory target we're going for, and then it activates the initial motor plan. And this is where errors can occur. If you accidentally activate the wrong motor plan, this system can correct that by generating a forward prediction. This system is basically saying through SPT, oh, we're planning this word, is that right? And this doesn't match, so this is a suppression signal. What that means is that you're suppressing the wrong set of nodes on the auditory side. The target nodes are still active, so they're going to send an excitatory signal here, which works as a correction signal.
Okay? So the caption, the auditory is not auditory from the speech, or it's
a memory.
It's like a memory.
It's your memory of the sound pattern of the word at the phonological level. Yes. Yeah.
So this is really now, this is inviting to make a suggestion or something which relates to the way large language models work with actual sound, speech, just raw speech in a way. You have the speech and you have all these models, and then you have some kind of an attention mechanism selecting which model you're going to use. So you tie now language with the speech signal through kind of a very abstract neural network.
Yeah, I would love to see someone try to model this stuff in detail. All I've done is really toy modeling and to show that this kind of detection and correction mechanism would work. I can refer you to a paper where I show this simulation. It does work and it has interesting properties, but it's just really something model, a larger scale something.
Which paper is this?
It's a single authored paper in Nature Review of Neuroscience in 2012.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why did you assume that the mistakes would be made in sending the information to the motor areas and not to the other?
Yeah, so good question. What if we activate the wrong target? So we activated rat here when we really wanted to say cat. So rat gets activated here. Sorry, let's say, yeah, so
Cat is here, and rat would be out there.
yeah, so suppose this is cat and this is rat, and this sends activation for cat. So now we have an error relative to this, but correct for this. So what the system would do is correct it to the error. So it would actually say, no, it's not cat that we're trying to hit. We're trying to hit rat. And it would correct it. So the implication is that this is ground truth. This is what the system is trying to generate. And if this is generated in error, then you're screwed. You're just going to say the wrong thing. So
is it this Freudian theory about lapsus and how you say stuff that you're not
exactly, yeah. So we've all experienced a speech error where you say something and someone says boy, and you're like, no, I didn't say boy, I said girl, and 4 people said no, you said boy, and you're not aware of it. Why? Because you activated the wrong target. and you produced it correctly in your head, so you didn't recognize the error. Yeah.
Also, you use words which are kind of a CBC. Are you implying that this is really happening at the very simple CBC consonant vowel?
Yeah, no, I think it's variable in length. I think of it as different lengths. So yeah, for some reason, cat psycholinguists just use cat for everything. It's like it's the only word they can think of. So I just continue doing that. Yeah.
But how is the rat motor primitive selected in the first place? You have the word cat that you want to say, and what is the process that selects the word rat?
How do you end up building this connection?
Yeah.
My best guess is it's something like Hebbian learning. So basically, you suppose initially you've learned a sensory. You're a kid and you've learned cat, okay, and then you learn what it means, so you can map it to semantics. And now you want to say it. So maybe the initial step in doing that is you start with the word, and then you activate the sound pattern, and then you send a excitatory signal to a motor plan that you execute, and then you see if it matches. And then you learn to activate the right motor plan to hit this target that you've activated through this route. But you get good at it over time, and pretty soon this network is active while this network is active, and maybe there's some heavy learning going on, so that you can skip this and go straight to here. There's evidence in motor control that there are kind of initial sketches of a motor plan that happen, and that's how I think of this, that this is kind of like a first pass. We're getting close. Let's just try this as a sketch, and then we can kind of fine tune it later on. So that's how I think of it. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think it's interesting because kind of like you're trying to solve an inverse problem, like producing the right audio output, but it's difficult to do. And so in this setup, you would try something and then get like to a forward pass to a correction, do it iteratively and so on.
Yeah. So I mean, you can think of this as a Babel network. So if the kid is doing two things, they're learning sound patterns. So they're hearing mama and water and all these things. And then at the same time, they're going ba 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 ba, making all these sounds, learning a relation between stuff that they do there and what it sounds like. And then pretty soon you kind of just align those things.
And interestingly, at first they have a fine-grained perception of all the phonemes, and later it's sort of like selected by maybe actually these motor patterns.
Yeah, so you get some tuning at this level based on the phonemes that you're actually hearing. So you don't need to hear R and L. Yeah, just the ones that you need to hear and produce. That's right. Is there another question?
Again, so again, analogy back to reaching. Execution, if we cut planning short, oftentimes there's deficits in execution or more efficient.
Yeah, right.
And as you're describing this actually, the internal model feels like a planning process to me. Where now, you could selectively, if you're in a performant environment where you need to respond quickly, you might bypass the internal model and just start producing. Yeah. Have you seen? Have you run experiments or aware of experiments?
I haven't run experiments informally. I make way more speech errors in talks than I do when I'm not under pressure. So yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I do see this as motor planning. Motor planning for speech involves this process, and you can produce a lot of speech without doing any correction. Highly learned words, things that are automatic. You just go straight to the motor plan and spew it out. But if it's complicated, if it's multisyllabic, if it's hard to pronounce, then you're going to have to use this system. So yeah, I think that's true. I don't know of any experiments you can make. Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry to bring it up, but it looks a little bit like a diffusion model, where we, like this classical nowadays, where you put the text and it produces the image. It has this loop inside.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Where it corrects itself.
Yeah.
Stable diffusion. Yeah, exactly. Like a stable. So you have a cat with the LLM output, and then there is this too.
I'm not a sophisticated modeler, so that sounds cool. Thank you. I hope someone can do something with it. All right, so it's like a nifty trick, like a nifty homework exercise to see how can we integrate it. Neat, but does it do anything for us empirically? It doesn't explain anything. And one thing it does is explain this conduction aphasia syndrome that I mentioned quite well. Conduction aphasia, like I said, involves good auditory comprehension, speech perception. Their output is fluid. The motor system is working okay at the motor level, but they make a lot of phonological errors. And people talk about it as being a selectively phonological deficit. They show word length effects in their error patterns, and non-word repetition is really hard. So how do we explain conduction aphasia? By the way, conduction aphasia, wait for it. The lesions in conduction aphasia kind of align with SPT. This is one study we did, so that's at least circumstantial evidence that conduction aphasia is caused by damage to this interface network. So damage to this system causes conduction aphasia. So perception is fine because this system is intact, this part of the system is intact. Production is fluid because you can activate the motor plans just fine. But if something happens to go wrong in the motor planning or motor selection at the in speech, and so they make more phonological errors. Once they make the error, they can detect it because this is correctly activating the target, and they say, no, that's not what I wanted to say. And then they try to correct it, and they usually fail in the correction effort. So that explains conduction aphasia quite nicely. Where it's really hard to explain this syndrome without some sort of a mechanism like this. Yeah.
And if it's specific to external speech, you ask them to reproduce word X, or is this also self-generated?
Both. So repetition is often used as a diagnostic for conduction aphasia, simply because if I ask you to repeat speech, especially if it's hard to remember the verbatim, you're going to rely on this system. Conduction aphasics will sometimes, for complicated low-frequency sentences, they will sometimes paraphrase. So you say, the disgruntled pastry chef, repeat that to me, and they'll say, the angry baker. So why? Because they've comprehended it fine, and then they've activated the motor plan associated with what they comprehended, but the verbatim is different. You're understanding it semantically, and then you're selecting your own words. So yeah, but in just fluid output, they will make in just normal output every day. They'll get stuck on a word, presumably a plan went wrong, they made an error, it was detected, and then they were just like, no, that's not what I meant to say. I'm going to try again. Okay, so there's more data to support this. I won't bother you with it. This is another exercise that I did trying to, this is what I've showed you so far. This is auditory targets, motor targets, SPT. I had these combined into one box, and now I've separated them out. So this here is a standard psycholinguistics model, concept, word, phonology, but this is split apart. This bothered me because I thought, is this split too? Is this a motor sensory? And the answer is yes, but I wasn't there yet. And this is just to acknowledge that auditory motor systems are not the only sensory motor aspect of speech production. Somatosensory systems are also very important. So I hypothesized that cerebellum seems like a good candidate for the coordinate transform. I thought, I won't dwell on that either. So yeah.
Cerebellum fits where? Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So cerebellum is the homologue to SPT at a lower level.
Okay.
Yeah, a bit of an off-tangent question. So if one were to treat with melody, would they be able to escape that aphasia? Does melody help?
Melody? So yeah, that's interesting. We're going to hold that thought. We're going to come back to that.
I'm going to go back to the question about so we're now imagine length of time for processing, or you have a play or a syllable, or so one word, because it's semantic, I guess.
Word?
Word.
That's just kind of historical. So I assume that there are multiple words. So you could replace this with morphemes.
I see.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, there's different ways people used to refer to this level. And all of them are kind of, morpheme is the right one. Or lemma is another. Okay, so this is the evidence that the cerebellum is involved. This was an altered auditory feedback experiment we did in cerebellar patients. They show exaggerated feedback responses. And you can explain that if the damage to the cerebellum is disrupting this lower level circuit and they're relying more on auditory feedback, causing an exaggerated response. All right, so that's talk number 2. This relates to the music stuff. So those of you who are interested in music, this might be the more relevant part. I know we're 45 minutes in, so I'm gonna speed up a little bit, stop me as usual. So like I showed you, when we did our SPT studies or these auditory motor circuits, we saw two frontal areas, and we never knew what that meant. And I just assumed that there were different levels. Maybe the dorsal one was a lower level motor plan, and Broca's area related one was a higher level. And that sat for almost 2 decades without explanation. And it shows up across a lot of studies. This is the dual stream model as it emerged in the more popular paper that David and I wrote in 2007. And you see the two areas that I colored in here basically correspond to those two zones. No explanation of the differences if you read the paper, because we didn't have them. But there is now evidence. This is just showing up, this is a direct cortical stimulation. So this is stimulating the brain of people undergoing neurosurgery, asking them to produce speech, counting in this case, and you look at areas that cause speech arrest. And what I want to point out here is that you get these clusters, the yellow and green cluster on the ventral and dorsal zone. The ventral one is not in Broca's area, it's in the precentral gyrus. Okay? So what are these two areas doing? And I'm going to quickly highlight 3 different recent bits of evidence that suggest that the dorsal one is coding pitch-related production features. The ventral one is more phonetic. Okay, so we're going to talk about the fact that the dorsal one is involved in controlling voice pitch during speaking and singing, and it codes acoustic features during speech listening. The ventral one is more implicated in other kinds of things, for example, in developmental stuttering. This is a study from Eddie Chang's group at UCSF. We're looking for areas that corresponded to production where they varied pitch accent on the words. So this is the example. You say, I never, what's the phrase? I never said, I never said she stole my money, and so on, putting pitch emphasis on each word. And then you look at the neural recordings to see which areas in the brain produce a modulation of that high gamma activity associated with that pitch change.
Quick question. Tonal language are basically emphasizing the articulation between the two even much more.
Yeah. So this is a multi-site study. It involves sites in France, in Canada, in the US, and in Shanghai. And a lot of those dorsal points, there was more representation in the Shanghai population in those sites. So yeah, I think there's something to that. Absolutely. So here's the basic result. You look in the brain for areas that show a sensitivity to this pitch production paths, and it shows up in this dorsal, they call it laryngeal motor cortex, but it's not. It is on the precentral gyrus, that dorsal region. And it shows up in singing, it shows up in speech, it shows up, it activates during listening and during speaking. That's the singing one. I'm not going to dwell on it. If you stimulate it, you get involuntary vocalizations, things like that. You'll vocalize, vowels.
If you
stimulate it, electrically stimulate it, you can induce.
How do you do that?
Yeah, so this is neurosurgery. They're undergoing neurosurgery. So you stimulate it directly, and you can lift it. What?
TMS, maybe you could do the same.
You could try. I don't know. Yeah, it'd be interesting. You don't see those kinds of effects when you stimulate ventral areas. If you get anything at all, you get maybe grunts. Things like that. Something.
So is it bilateral?
Yeah, probably bilateral. I'm thinking this, we don't know yet. I don't know yet for sure, but there's evidence that suggests some bilateral organization. In general, I think of the lateralization pattern as the closer you are to the periphery, either on the motor or the sensory side, the more bilateral it is. That's my assumption. All right, independent of that, some work in my own lab by a grad student who was interested in mapping auditory cortex in terms of spectrotemporal receptive fields. He developed a method to do that in fMRI. And he identified regions colored here that show statistically reliable spectrotemporal receptive field maps. So basically they show auditory receptive fields. That's essentially what it is. So we found that, but noticed that this one other area showed a nice strong response as well in motor cortex, right on premotor cortex. And it turned out that zone overlap areas that show speech effects. That's what these little spheres are, that show like our SPT effects. It's the same zone. They look like A1. They look like low-level auditory codes, including regions representing pitch, regions of the spectral temporal function representing pitch. You don't see that here, for example. That's the other frontal zone we got. And you see it in low level. You don't see it in high level auditory areas that are more responsive to languagey stuff. You see it in A1. So these low level acoustic features are coded in that zone, including pitch. Yeah.
So could pitch be kind of a linking signal between areas?
Pitch, yeah, so that's the story I'm developing here, that it's involved in controlling pitch. This is just,
How do you get 4 hertz resolution with fMRI?
Basically what you do, the way this is, it's a bubbles method. So you take speech and you transform it into spectral temporal space, and that like a sentence, and then you put a filter over it and allow parts of that spectral temporal space to filter through, and then you play that sentence to the person in the scanner, and you look to see what brain activity you get in every voxel. And then you repeat it with a new filter, and again and again and again, and eventually you get a map that looks something like this, that says, when information is getting through in this zone, that voxel activates well. And so you end up with a STRF map.
Like something associated.
Yeah.
Is it still intelligible now?
What?
Is it still intelligible when it's filtered, or depends on the filter?
I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. So this is just.
I'm just saying that because if it's not intelligible, maybe you're missing on some higher order semantic integration information that could come from the.
Yeah, so we do worry about that for other maps. So this is the typical map you see for speech. This is like the zone of the STRF. It is important for intelligible speech. If all you get is information in this range, you can understand speech. If you don't get it, you don't understand speech. This region isn't important. You lose the pitch, that's speaker voice, it's prosody and stuff like that. So you get mappable STRFs in high-level language areas that aren't presumably auditory representations. They're just responding to speech. And so they activate when you get speech. Intelligible speech. Yeah. So we compare intelligible versus unintelligible speech to make sure we're seeing an auditory signal. Lots of details in this slide. I'm not going to go into this. Just trust me that the ventral one is doing something phonetic. So we've identified these 2 areas, and these are the ROIs, just showing that the location as we identify them with fMRI, that's the circles, the 2 zones in our SPT task, listen, rehearse, versus the speech arrest locations are basically the same. That we're talking about the same areas. And then we can look at those zones. So that's the yellow again and the blue. I ended up calling these the dorsal precentral speech area and the ventral precentral speech area, which is not to imply that it is speech specific or anything like that. It's just important to see that. That's those zones. The colored bars here represent different cytoarchitectonic areas. So this is premotor cortex. So these zones are in premotor cortex. Here's Broca's area. This one overlaps Broca's area a little bit. These 2 regions are laryngeomotor cortex. So I'm going to talk about that briefly because that's important. I don't know that I'll dwell on it, but basically the idea here is that we're familiar, those who do speech language neuroscience are familiar with a hierarchy in this zone. So there's like a Broca's area that's doing some higher level stuff. And then premotor cortex is doing lower level stuff, and then primary orofacial cortex is the M1 version of that, familiar with that. And what I'm arguing for is that there is a separable hierarchy involved in coordinating pitch production. So that would be for song and prosody. That's the idea based on the data. And there are levels of that. So this is dorsal laryngeomotor cortex, which is unique in humans. Non-human primates only have a ventral one, which seems to be more involved in just opening and closing the larynx. This one is involved in pitch control. The higher level one is coordinating that at some like premotor level, whatever that means. It's not clear what it's actually doing. And then there's a higher level language area just anterior to that seems to be implicated in syntax. My guess is it's implicated in syntax because prosody is tightly linked with syntax, and people have argued that it's a planning frame for producing sentences. So that's something we're investigating.
The parallel hierarchy between perception and production, or
this is all on the
on the production,
all on the production, on the quote motor side.
I'm wondering if song is also ordered in a separate way.
I think this system for like singing. So we're talking about not professional, we're talking about singing basically.
Yeah.
And it seems to involve these areas.
What about if you hear song?
It'll activate like this. These areas activate for listening, just like they do for speech. Yeah. I mean, that was the SPT study. We had people listening to speech and rehearsing it, and listening to melodies and rehearsing it, and we got activity in that area for both. Yeah.
And with the pianist, it was a piano song.
Yeah,
so they were supposed to imagine it as well.
They just
imagine playing.
No, for the non-musician, like this regular sample, we asked them to add that humming step.
Humming, yes.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's
bilateral.
What's that?
Is it bilateral?
I think this one is, yeah. Certainly in the ECOG recordings, the intracranial recordings of that pitch modulation study.
It's left.
In the SPT is left dominant. I haven't looked hard at the lateralization pattern of this zone. I didn't know what this was when we saw it in the data, and I didn't care initially. Now I care. So we didn't really evaluate its lateralization pattern, but I think it's more bilateral. So that's just a close-up of the anatomical location of these zones. I'm going to skip this. Here, the connectivity is interesting. So if you take those two zones as seeds in functional connectivity, so this is fMRI resting state data, and you look at the connectivity pattern, they're distinct. This one, the ventral one, is connected to higher level somatosensory cortex. This dorsal one is connected more to auditory regions, which makes sense if you're doing pitch coding, including A1. So yeah, there you go. I'm going to skip that. So, well, I guess I should say, this is SPT. This is a meta-analysis of the location of SPT, plotted as a function of a functional connectivity-based parcellation. And the point I want to illustrate is that SPT crosses boundaries between different regions that link up to different zones. This is an interesting zone. Here's auditory cortex and like maybe auditory belt areas connecting to this dorsal zone, not to the ventral zone. SPT captures both of those, but also captures some of this stuff, which links into higher level ventral regions. I don't exactly know how to interpret this in detail, but my thinking now is that SPT is a kind of conglomerate area doing similar functions for different systems. So briefly, why do we have these two systems? Well, it makes sense evolutionarily, is what I want to say. So pitch control requires, obviously, pitch-related auditory input. In non-human primates, that information is going into dorsal premotor areas. So that is the area in our pre-speech brain was already getting the right kind of input, sensory input, to evolve a controller for pitch.
Sorry, did you say dorsal or ventral?
Sorry?
Did you say dorsal or ventral?
Dorsal.
Say,
what did I say?
No, because it's
the non-human primate ventral system controls oral facial gestures, but it doesn't. So if we're going to look at the non-human primate and say what area would be a good, where should we build this pitch control system? Well, the first thought and what most people think is that, well, you have this ventral system in primates that controls moving the mouth and pushing the tongue around. That's where we should evolve our system. The problem is to get auditory input of the sort that's necessary for controlling it. The dorsal system, even in the non-human primate, gets the right kind of input. So it makes sense that that's control system evolved there.
And so what does it control?
It controls the larynx via the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex.
I see.
Yeah, so that's a whole interesting story. The dorsal laryngeal motor cortex only exists in humans.
Right.
People think that the evolution of that is what enabled speech in general, because you have to get control of the larynx. So if you think in the non-human primate, what system does get the right kind of input? If you just empirically, it's that dorsal zone. Well, where is that input going? It's going to like the frontal eye fields. So that makes sense, right? If you hear a sound on one side of the room, you want to be able to orient, control your eyes. But the frontal eye fields is a misnomer. It's not just eye control. It's controlling all sorts of orienting. So if you record from there, you'll get activity while animals are moving their eyes, but if they move their head or covertly direct attention, it's a more general orienting system. So that's important. Auditory input is important for those kinds of things, including spectral features. So if you think about sound localization, left-right is all about interaural time and level differences, but orienting in the vertical direction is all about spectral shape. So lower level acoustic information is going to be needed for orienting in the up-down direction. And we're quite well tuned to it. So your pinna exaggerates frequency differences in the vertical dimension. If you're out, when you're going on your hike tomorrow, stop and listen and notice where the high frequency sounds are coming from versus the low frequency sounds. The brooks and things, lower frequency, they're low. The birds are high. And we are tuned to that. So are infants. So we mislocalize things in the vertical direction according to the pitch that it's played, because we're tuned to hear that difference. So that's interesting. So it's related to orienting, and I just want to point out this one thing. I'm going to skip that. This weird finding. So I never thought I would use Ariana Grande in my scientific talks, but tell me whether she's hitting a high note or a low note. Obviously. No one hits the high note like this, right? Okay. So why is that? Well, this makes some sense. If vocal production is related to an orienting system. So it turns out not only Ariana Grande, but if you just measure orienting responses, the height of your eyebrows, the where you're looking in your head position, the height of your gestures, they correlate with the pitch of your voice. And that's, you can do that in speech. It's been studied in tone languages. Same thing. There's a connection between pitch height in vocalization and orienting responses in the vertical direction. So that's some evidence for that. This is for the musicians. If you look at where music in general, like in fMRI, it localizes to the same zone. So there's something about music in that zone.
How about rappers?
Rappers?
Yeah.
No idea. Good question. So there's music. You can see that same bar. All right, I'm going to skip this. There's hypotheses about these things. So here's, without going into the evidence, here's what I think happened in our evolutionary history. We first evolved song in some form. That came first. That serves as the foundation. Darwin hypothesized this. It's not news, but it's controversial. What's that?
Rousseau as well as a whole.
Yeah. There's people are getting interested in this idea again. On top of that came evolution of supralaryngeal control, involving this ventral circuit because they were already wired up to control it for chewing and other kinds of oral facial gestures, etc. So that's that.
Is there any evidence for, maybe I'm pushing it, but any evidence for tonal language being more ancestry because of this feature?
I don't know. Yeah, I haven't thought about it. Chinese. I don't know what people have.
What is Chinese is very, because there is one language in Europe that is also tied to a earlier branch. So maybe that's.
Yeah. All right. So we're more than an hour in. Do you want to stop? Or do you want to?
I don't want to stop.
Do you want to read through this?
They're yelling at me from
To stop. Okay.
We can maybe wherever you think is a good place to stop and let people who want to leave, and then we can just continue.
Yeah. Okay. Well, for those of you who want to leave, the answer to the question of what is the motor system doing for perception is basically nothing.
That's the mode of the speech.
And
What was the question?
and here I wrote a book on it, so if you want details, we can do that.
Oh no.
But I have
We'll be here all day.
I have a few slides just to give you some of the details. So
Okay.
I'll
So
stop.
anybody wants to leave,
Well, because there's a lecture at 10:30 here.
Yeah.
So,
we'll finish like this.
okay, no, I'm just saying, so.
What is the myth of neuronerds?
They're not doing what they're claimed to be doing. They exist. Yeah, so mirror neurons are, do you want me to just talk? So here's mirror neurons. If you don't know what mirror neurons, are, they're recorded initially in F5 of the macaque. They respond when the monkey is grasping things. That's not exciting. They knew that already. But they also respond when the monkey watches someone do the same action, grasping for things. The interpretation of that is this. That action is activated in our brain. So the way you understand what I'm doing when I reach for my phone is you simulate that movement in your frontal motor system. And because you know what you're doing, when you generate that movement, you can assume that I'm doing the same. That's the mirror theory. Okay, neat. And then it was extended to speech. We understand speech because it activates speech-related mirror neurons in our brain. And in fact, there's some, if you don't look too hard, there's plenty of evidence. You could look to my studies, activation of frontal mirror neuron-related areas while you're listening to speech. But you have to look at the broader data. And a lot of that comes from, what the prediction of this is. So if any of you are neurophysiologists or look at that literature, you can record neurophysiological signals and generate a hypothesis about what that area is doing. But then the real test is to damage it and make sure that behavior goes away, right? But then okay, it's involved in that. So let's do that experiment with mirror neurons. And
I'll let you.
Yeah, okay. Let's do that experiment with mirror neurons and see what happens when you damage the mirror neuron system. Broca's aphasia is a aphasia syndrome that involves good auditory comprehension. So perception is pretty good, at least at the word level, but their output is non-fluent. The damage, this is an overlay of 57 lesions in 57 patients with Broca's aphasia. You can see the peak is in motor speechy related areas. However, which is a problem for the mirror neuron here because they have good auditory comprehension. That's what defines the syndrome. So that prediction doesn't pan out. Furthermore, the ability to comprehend language, which is what this lesion map is showing you, and it involves these are backwards, sorry. This is a comprehension map. This is a fluency production map, and they're different areas. If the mirror neuron theory would predict that they should be the same areas and involve frontal regions. That's just showing the same thing. Lots of evidence shows that speech perception is well preserved without motor speech ability. For example, in bilateral opercular syndrome. So this is a syndrome where you have lesions or damage to both motor related speech areas, and it produces a complete inability to control the vocal tract, to talk. They're completely mute. We studied a couple patients with this, and their ability to perceive speech was fine. So that's not predicted. In cerebral palsy, people who've never learned the ability to speak because of motor problems nonetheless have perfectly preserved speech perception ability. And of course, chinchillas who don't have the biological capacity for speech can perceive speech sounds in a human-like way. Also, Japanese quail can do this. So there's nothing special about the perception of speech in order to understand it. So most people say, well, and the data also show causal effects of motor disruption on speech perception. And yeah, you can find studies that apply TMS to premotor cortex and produce and have people listening to syllables, and they are to point to the syllable that they heard, and you get a decremented performance. So baseline, it's a noise, so you get people off the ceiling, and then you apply TMS to the premotor cortex, and you can drop their ability down by about 10%. But there's a problem if you look more broadly, which is that syllable discrimination. So this is not unintuitive completely, and in part led to the dual stream model. The ability to tell the difference between ba and pa, I give you that task. It seems like it's testing speech perception, and it is in part, but not completely. So that ability double dissociates from the ability to comprehend words using those same sounds. So ba, da, same, different, a patient can fail, but you give them a picture of a bear. You give them the word bear, and you say, point to the picture. One is a bear, one is a pear. You have to discriminate those sounds. They can point to the bear reliably. So a comprehension task using the same necessity to discriminate or recognize the difference between the phonemes is not the same as measuring measuring it with syllable discrimination. All the TMS studies do it that way. So the task is wrong. And I can just illustrate this to you. So what's going on here? So listen to the next sentence I say carefully. These sublexical tasks invoke processes that are not used in normal speech recognition or comprehension. That last sentence I uttered that I asked you to pay attention to, was there a paw? The sound paw. Anybody know?
No.
Was that an obvious thing? Did you just go, no, obviously, or yes, obviously. Or did you have to think about it?
Yeah.
Most people don't know, right? You just don't, you're listening to words, you're not hearing syllables. But if I ask you to listen for a paw, these sublexical tasks are, you can do it. You're attending to the syllable level set. That additional attention process is what's getting disrupted in aphasia, causing problems on that task, not the that's why you get the dissociation. So TMS is disrupting attention to syllables and noise, not the ability to perceive them. And this is a large-scale lesion study that basically demonstrated this. Let me see if I get to this. So here's probably the cleanest comparison. This is that pair task in comprehension. Let me just finish this one point and then I'll stop. Auditory word comprehension in noise. You hear bear, you point to it. It's on this axis. Versus pair bear, that task, same or different. Same patients, same stimuli, basically, different task. And you can see that the two abilities are essentially uncorrelated. Yeah.
Just another point that could be made in the same argument is that when the kids learn to read, they have to go through this phase of phonetic awareness.
Yes.
That's not absolutely automatic to them. And then after that, they can really do this mapping between the phonemes and the two letters.
Right. Yeah, and it's there's an old study, I don't know if it would replicate, but there's an old study that says people who are illiterate cannot do syllable discrimination.
Yeah, yes, because kids don't.
Yeah, so the ability to tell the difference between bar and pause is related to reading. It's not related to speech comprehension. So anyway, yeah. So
defense of the mirror neurons.
What's that?
In defense of the mirror.
Yes, sir.
I just want to say, there's no doubt in your slides and all that stuff, you showed what a mirror neuron is.
Yes.
And so there's no doubt about scientific evidence for existence of such a neuron. What we're debating is what is for.
Right.
And you said the interpretation given that this is helps you understand and all that stuff, comprehension or recognition, is one interpretation. There are many other possible interpretations for such a system. For example, it could be SPD. You need it for learning the mapping.
Exactly.
You don't need it for comprehension.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with the mirror neuron.
No.
It's the interpretation given by some people who prefer the interpretation.
That's right. It became dominant. I mean, TSA agents were being trained on mirror neuron theory to help. So some correction is needed. And yes, I've been criticized because it sounds like I'm saying mirror neurons don't exist. But
no, but I mean, you showed your data showing.
Yes, I believe mirror neurons, but I believe that they're a necessary part of all animals. I mean, it's just sensory motor integration. Yeah. That's all it is. It has nothing to do with comprehension, and that's needed across the board. Nothing special about that.
So this second part will continue along the lines of fundamentals of physical foundations in computing, communications, controls. Everybody look at it, right? So that will entertain us now with some deeper physical insights, and all boils down to efficiency and energy, because that's how we all operate. Because we have all constraints. Constraints of extracting here has nothing to do with resources of the environment. And so, whichever group you're in, this will be very helpful. So
thank you again. Thanks for your interest. So, given the talk before, I'm coming at it from physics, and I will try to walk you through a single switching of a neuron, and then we will go into software and algorithms and how to design a computer in first principles. So I will talk about the neuronal synapses first. So if from a physicist perspective, somebody were to ask me what evolution is, I would say it is the most efficient way to process information at the lowest end. So everything evolution does is, given the current constraints, it tries to maximize information process. That is, I mean, this is just a comment. I mean, it's a premise. I cannot prove it, but you will see when I go through a single synapses how it is. So I'm going to first show you about a single synapses in a neuron. I have seen people talk saying that the computer is as efficient as a neuron. They will show you the numbers. And tend to kind of underestimate what it takes to essentially for a neuron to switch. So if you try to compare a single synapses to neuron, you have to actually look at it a little bit more detail, and which is what I'm going to do. So let's look at the brain and the computing element. This is essentially information processing taken from a paper in 2017. These are the signals coming from the neuron. So I have tried to kind of magnify that. There is a large subthreshold voltage fluctuations going, very analog level. But in dendrites, there's a hybrid analog. This is the signal. This is my representation. Indicate a hybrid analog and digital code. So it's a combination of that. Now, if you look into a single switching, this is 90 genes are dedicated for neuromodulators. So not every switching is the same. In addition to that, there are inorganic gases like nitric oxide and all that are also neuromodulators. So at the same switching, it processes the information differently depending on what modulator is used. 90 genes are dedicated to that. That's a pretty big number. And then there are the number of neuromodulators are higher, and it happens by chemical diffusion of transport, but in a very specific way. And then here's a figure, it recycles the molecules. So after the switching is done, it doesn't throw it away like what we do in computers.
And a lot of the cells in neural tissue, astrocytes and whatnot, are really involved with this.
Oh yeah, glial cells, right.
Glial cells.
Right.
And we never really talk about this.
Right. In fact, glial cells are part of the recycling is done by glial cells, not the neurons. Astrocytes. So now I'm going to quantify the energy. So the total power is 20 watts is what is estimated for the brain. You can assume about 70% utilitarian, that's about 14 watts. If you assume a single switching is half millisecond, you can look at the frequency of the switching, and you can actually estimate the switching as a top-down estimate. 14 watts, you have about 8 times 10 to the power 14 synapses. So you can actually estimate the energy, and that comes to between 8.75 and 10.5 attojoules, that is 10 to the power minus 18 joules for single switching, top-down estimate. Now let's try to do a bottom-up estimate. Number of synapses per gram, you can estimate the molecules of glucose that is metabolized, and per synapses in a millisecond, 30 ATPs are used, 30 ATP molecules. And then you can actually estimate based on the energy that it is about 7.72 times 10 to the power minus 19 or 0.7 attojoules. So the ratio of synapses to thermodynamics limit is 96. So it is operating 100x of the thermodynamic limit, bottom-up calculation. Top-down showed the energy was higher. That is the way it typically is. Top-down estimates overestimate, bottom-up estimate underestimate. So you can bound it. So you can easily say that it's of the order of joules per switch. Okay. Now let's quantify what all it has to do in order to do that switching. Please look at the right-hand side. Then the way the switching happens is these neuromodulators are packed in what are called vesicles. So it actually packs them, and it's the vesicles that are sent out. Okay. And for the person who actually discovered this, he got a Nobel Prize on that. So let's kind of take a number of molecules in a vesicle, about 3,000. That's a lower estimate. 3,000 molecules are packed into vesicles. 12 vesicles are released across the synapses gap. So so that comes to 36,000 molecules, and that is one switching. Okay. The way in chemistry, there is a fingerprinting scale called Morgan's fingerprint used to simulate chemical molecule. That means you need 1024 bits to represent chemistry. If you do that, the number of bits you need to have a single synapses is 36 million bits are needed. So what you call as a bit of switching in a computer, what brain calls as a switching, you need 36 million of computing bits to switch it just like the brain.
Well, I'm not sure that's correct. I mean,
Let's discuss this.
Yeah, because I don't think every molecule there, I think there is an sample code there. We didn't talk about the coding between the vesicle release and this reception.
What do you mean by coding?
Okay, so I mean coding. Every
Means some information?
Yes, how is information encoded in those molecules?
That is where the Morgan fingerprint is. That number is supposed to represent that.
What?
So 1024 bits is how chemists have been doing it for a long time. So I just borrowed that number for coding. That represents the code.
Yeah, I didn't understand what you mean by coding there.
Yeah. So that particular, I mean, if 64 bits for a floating point,
yes,
the equivalent of that number is 1024 for a chemical molecule. That is the way the coding I had captured.
Okay, I'm not sure.
Stuff maybe connected to what Andreas is suggesting. So let's say we do this now for a transistor, right?
Right.
And it's going to be also larger number of electrons. Right?
You asked the question.
Yeah.
So that's actually a deep question, and I've been thinking about it since you asked a few months back. The difference is this: in the transistor, we are not using the complexity. But the brain is actually using the complexity of the molecules and the vesicles.
Except until carbamide came along and says, let's use a transistor for doing much more than switch.
That is the point. That is. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I think also like to Andreas' question, I think this is, if I understand correctly, this is if you want to do a faithful description of everything that is happening at the synapse, not necessarily that it's not necessarily true that everything that happens at the synapse is functionally relevant, right?
That's a good point. That is the statistics. That is why you need 36,000 molecules.
Yeah.
Right? Because the whole point of this is to make an estimate, the complexity estimate, right? Whether this number ends up being 36 million or 10 million or 100 million, we can kind of get into the details, but this gives you an order of magnitude of the complexity of what an equivalent digital computer will have to do in terms of getting the information across.
I disagree completely with this calculation. Basically, if you have 30,000 molecules, the way molecules are encoded there is a univariate representation as a rate code, think of it, a rate code space. Then you have basically log 2 of 30,000, which is about 11 bits. That's all you have there.
Sorry? No.
Log of 32,000, log 2 of 30,000 is about 11.
Why am I taking log 2 of 1?
Because the way the synapse encodes the information from the left side to the right side is in a unitary representation, which is a rate code in space.
I'm treating the whole synapses switching as a chemical phenomenon, not as a unitary.
It is not, it's a binding, unbinding of one molecule with one very specific receptor.
I agree, but if you need statistically there, and this is, I am giving an estimate based on chemistry. You can have an estimate based on unitary thing, and you'll get a different number. So that will essentially bound it. I'm not disagreeing with the number, but the basic formalism I'm actually showing.
We can
right? Right. So,
Question?
yes.
So how are we going to use transistors to do this?
Oh, that is a different question. I mean, to use the transistor to pass so much information is a much harder thing. So this is trying to compare it in terms of information. So now we can actually do the analysis that I did yesterday. So if we say that a single synapses switching is a single state change, then you have micro state change. You are going through bits to instructions in the computer. Algorithm of the translational entropy that I showed yesterday, you come up with a number of the order of 10.8. Let's call it 10. So what is actually happening is, when we use a single transistor to do a bit switching, and this, to represent the synapses switching, this much of complexity is being collapsed into a bit switching. And to Gert's point, actual transistor switching is more complicated, right? But an electron is an electron. The bit is being switched using electrons, where the synapses is being switched in vesicles using separate molecules where information is encoded. It's not whether the molecule is, if you look into the dynamics of synapses, then you have to say that you have to have the diffusion, and then whether it sticks or not, then whether you have the ion channels opening or not, all those processes are simplified here. Even without that, the complexity is at least 10 orders of magnitude higher. So, and the other point is, to compute a synapses, it takes 10.83 orders of magnitude if I were to simulate it. How to do it is not something I'm discussing, but I'm just trying to make a point of how many orders of magnitude are this. Now, at this particular point, I want to kind of say that the energy of transistor switching for the latest generation is close to synapses. If you just look a bit of a synapses switching as a bit, and the transistor switching as a bit, both are within attojoules. So they're actually very close. But the point I'm arguing is the complexity is essentially at the computing element is done hierarchically, a lot more hierarchically. And neuromorphic systems emulate a partial set of the above characteristics. So this is actually showing how 4,000 nerve fibers connect to a single neuron, how complex the system is, the connectivity is. And nature-inspired architectures need more innovations across, not just at the switching level, but also at the architecture level and at the informational basis. How much information you can operate per switch. Now I'm going to show you something about the software. Yesterday when I talked about hardware, architecture, and informational basis, I did not talk about software. So today I'm going to show you what it takes to train a ChatGPT model and why algorithms can totally overwhelm everything on the architecture and the hardware. So this is essentially showing scaling, different orders of scaling, n squared, log n, and so on. Okay. This is, and this is the Avogadro number, approximately on the order of 10 to the power 24 there. Now, if you look into the methods of scaling that are used in quantum methods, fast Fourier transform to quantum Monte Carlo, they all stay in here. But an exascale computing that I talked about yesterday just came on board, still cannot solve from first principle systems beyond this number because of the scaling blocks. So there's an intrinsic scaling limitation. And the way we address that is we actually bend the scaling by using very accurate models at the low end and then taking the information and passing it into less accurate models. And that is the way we actually go through a hierarchical scaling in order to get that. And this is quantum chemistry methods do this. And this is essentially artificial learning. Artificial intelligence and machine learning also do it because they change the exponential learning into a pre-exponential factor. And that is how they are able to extend to larger systems. So now I'm going to go to GPT and show you the numbers. These are actually GPT 175 billion advances, which means 175 billion parameters. You can actually look at the accuracy and the number of parameters, as somebody I heard say yesterday, that it's going close to 1 trillion now. And this is actually taken, I think you mentioned it, Shankar, yesterday. So this is actually taken from one of the world's largest supercomputers. Training GPT will take a year on the whole Fugaku with FP32. So distributed training of large language models are hugely inefficient. So I will now estimate the energy for it. So take GPT chat 3.5, energy per floating point operations you need. You know the number of floating point operations needed for it. This is actually inference. Okay. The number of words per day chat GPT is doing, you can convert it to bits per day. Then you can convert to floating points per day and energy per floating point. We have good estimates. So it generates an average of 4.5 billion words. So if you use this analysis, this is the energy. The blue is the chat GPT training energy. The y-axis is kilowatt hour. The reason I put kilowatt hour is most of the people I talk to understand kilowatt hours, not joules. So this was transferred into kilowatt hour. So this is the low end of chat GPT training. This is inference for a low end and inference for a whole year. Now, there's a difference. Training takes about 55 to 60 days to train 175 billion parameter model. Inference is done around the year. So that's the underlying assumption. This is for a year, this is for the duration of training. The electricity consumption in California per capita and per USA, and this is the total energy spent by a human during his or her whole lifetime. And you can see that the training of a single model is one of the most expensive things. So, I mean, these are numbers that are, once you have it. So I showed this yesterday. Y-axis now is in joules per bit, per instruction or per application. This is the thermodynamic energy is the purple one. Single ATP to ADP is the green one. This is the transistor switching energy. These are instructions as you go through the floating point. Just look at the y-axis. I add the software and the algorithms, and this is the energy. Okay. From 10 to the power minus 15 or so, it went to 10 to the power plus 15. The first one is what it took to simulate a COVID virion protein, which I showed. The black one is cryptocoin mining, and this is the natural language processing training in ChatGPT. So this is why energy is such a big problem in computing. So you can see how many orders of magnitude it has essentially gone. So now, why does it need so much training? So I'm going to go a little bit more into statistics to explain why does it need this much of computing. English language model follows what is called a Zipf's law. So it's not a normal distribution, it's a Pareto distribution. And these are the top 15 words used in English language. The current American colloquial language has, lexicon has about 3 million words, okay? You can see that the distribution is Pareto. In fact, the last 15 sentences are not even English words, but they're colloquially being found by Google as words that are used. So when you actually try to train this, this is the power law, Pareto distribution. This is the normal distribution. So if you need, in order to train a Pareto law, you need an order of at least 1 trillion observations statistically. If it were a normal distribution, you don't need that. So partial information problems without constraints are limited by the availability of data. No free lunch. The reason machine learning models are efficient is you put all the energy into training, then the inference you assume is low. Okay, so that is the thing. Now, this is the input data into ChatGPT. Okay. Look at ChatGPT 3. These are in billions somewhere. Yeah, these are in gigabytes, okay? Please watch the colors carefully. Most of the things are from academic journals, you are getting about 101 gigabytes of data, but most of the data are coming from web crawling. So it's not even, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of the things on the web that are being used in the training. So this is real academic peer-reviewed journals are only a small fraction of the training data set. That's why it goes, because it's a power law. And this is taken from one of the Turing Award winners and Jan Lecken, who got it recently. They are all coming to the conclusion that the current method of training, so sometimes this may have some connection into memory and training, is the efficiency of using the right data set is important. The 2 points I wanted to make is it's using insane amounts of trials and large numbers of data, which is the luxury that science doesn't have. So I wanted to show you chemistry. I showed you 3 million words and how much you needed to train. These are the chemically available molecules. And if you look at the number of molecules that are there in chemistry, which follows a power law, this is taken from Rudy Marcus' paper on power laws in chemistry. And there's a publication we have made on that. You can look that up. Essentially, the point is the number of possible molecules can exceed 1 times 10 to the power 48, even in a very conservative case we are showing. Chemical reaction rates increase complexity. So if I am training something like a ChatGPT on 3 million words, needs so much, imagine what it would need on 10 to the power 48 chemistry molecules that I would want to simulate. And chemistry is the most complex, biology is 3 levels higher. And now I'm going to show you biology. This is actually something that we are working on. This is taken from a human cell in Stanford School of Medicine. And this is the actual chemical system in an immune response when a COVID is affected. This is our representation of the chemistry. You can see how complicated it is and why one of the models on that. The number of chemical reactions in a human body are of the order of 10 to the power 21 zeta scales per second. The number of chemical reactions in a single cell is an order of 1 billion, 500 million to 1 billion. And that there's no way you can train anything. So the point of this part of the talk is data is a problem too, not just energy. So how would we track the problem? So energy requirements present both challenges I mentioned, and data requirements have large-scale machine learning models will have a problem. One way in which you could use the translational entropy estimate is something that has been done by Kolmogorov before. There's something called Kolmogorov complexity, and here I'm explaining what it is. This is essentially a diagram on what is called a Julia set. Storing this 24-bit color map would take about 23 megabytes. A program to do it would be kilobytes. So the program complexity captures the data complexity. This is because this particular program understands the underlying math and physics. That's why you can get away with it. If you were to train it on a machine learning, you would need 23 megabytes of data to train that, which you don't need with a model. So the point I'm trying to make is data is a problem as much as energy is a problem. So now I will kind of go through one specific example. Any questions on this so far?
But the challenge is you don't know how you generate it. Like a program means like you don't know
anything about the
I know.
distribution, right? When you say cat and mouse.
That's a problem. I mean, I agree, but all I was saying was there is some work on complexity theory, chronographs, and it is not very useful because there is no, how to put it, there is no unique way to capture chronograph complexity. Let me put it that way. The translational complexity which I showed, at least I can identify what are assumptions I did, right? You could question the assumptions. Is it 36,000 molecules, 15,000 molecules, or atoms? That can be argued and the number will change. But here you can't even extract it. You cannot quantify it. If you cannot quantify it, then you cannot do anything with it. Its qualitative discussion is good. So that's a problem. So now I'm going to show one of the things we are starting to develop, and I'll show the initial results of this. So you all know this. This is not meant for the audience here. This is the Hopfield network from 1982, and that's a Boltzmann machine from 1985. These are recurrent networks, and there's a scalar associated with energy. And its distribution and a temperature to do stochastic rates. So what we are finding is, because I'm increasingly working with chemists and medical professionals, we wanted to study chemistry and we found out that the regular way of training is not going to work. So we need to capture some methods that would be able to do. So stochastic thermodynamics is a concept in which you don't have the entire, it's not equilibrium thermodynamics, it's non-equilibrium. The degrees of freedom are far fewer. So you can actually do dynamics of a smaller number of systems. So this bridges from stochastic dynamics to macroscopic thermodynamics that we are used to, which the Boltzmann machine was. So can we try to do it? That was the question we asked ourselves. So this is work in its early stages. So we construct a stochastic network, regularize the weights, and use back propagation to optimize the configuration and calculate the total energy of the network, which we try to modify. So I'm going to show you the figures. So it essentially starts with a regular network, but it essentially changes the connections between the network. So all kinds of connections can be tried out. So I'm just going to show you the initial results. We tried about 500 configurations on a simple system, and the configurations are dynamic. They can change during time. So this is comparison with the conventional neural network in the red. The y-axis is the mean squared error. The x-axis is the error. And you can actually see that one of them falls very quickly, one type of connectivity, the other one which essentially falls, but they also fall below that. And the statistics of this is essentially the minimum training loss. You can essentially see that it's actually bringing down the loss, even though there is still a distribution because the connectivity is stochastic. It can essentially go through that. So specific architectures are selected with less training loss. One of the things I've been talking to Jason is to see if this can be taped out as part of one of the tiny neural network. That was one of the discussions I think I mentioned to Joanna's and probably you as well. So that was what the NN is the Hopfield net and the STN is the STN is the stochastic thermodynamic. Yes, like a Boltzmann machine. Right. Yeah, it is like a Boltzmann distribution, but it does not look at temperature. So what it does is it looks at the overall energy. There's an energy for connection and the energy for the node. So we essentially calculate. So we look at the variations of it, and it essentially calculates the entropy, equivalent of informational entropy. And then it estimates, tries to lower the free energy, not the energy, the free energy, which means it uses the Boltzmann concept of temperature, but it changes. So particularly the energy, the point that I'm trying to make is new software architectures combining multiple principles of thermodynamics I showed. This is showing initial encouraging results. We haven't scaled it up to a large problem, so I don't know how this will perform. But the energy efficiency of computing is a problem here to stay. So now I will go back. We started off with Feynman's puzzle, and let's try to see if we can close them. The class of computing that I talked yesterday, I said you can classify that onto 8 levels. And the virtual machine computing is at class 0, Turing's machine. And the natural system is at class 7. Okay. There are all these classes in which not many computing architectures and hardwares have been formed yet. Just keep that at the back of your mind. Now I'm showing you the analysis which I showed last time, but combining everything, including what we talked about. X-axis is the energy estimated to do a specific application. Y-axis is the translational entropy that we discussed yesterday. These are the equivalent to 0-point energies. That is a natural system, which essentially is information processing needs this energy of the order of 10 to the power minus 20. When you do a quantum emulation, the translational entropy increases and the energy also increases, but this is the y-axis is already logarithmized because it's an entropy. The x-axis is an entropy, it's an energy, but has been made as a log curve. So when you go to general purpose computing, your energy is very high and your entropy, translational entropy is also high. So what does this mean?
Can you remind us what translational entropy means?
Oh, so that was something I discussed yesterday. So I'll explain what it is. So it is the ratio of the information processing. Let me just go over. Let me go. So I want to be precise because he's hearing it the first time. I don't want to say anything.
It's self-contained. That's business.
Sorry?
It's good to make it self-contained.
Right. So yeah. So you essentially have a certain number of operations you need to do. Let's say I'm going from state 1 to state 2. I have one state change. But if I use 100 micro states to make that change, okay? So chemical reaction, let's say it's going hydrogen, water decomposition, going to hydrogen and oxygen. It's a one state change.
Right.
But an actual simulation, the actual chemical reaction will have many micro states that it goes through, samples as it goes through.
Right.
So the ratio of the two, logarithm of that ratio is translation of information. So now, microstates, when I take it to a digital computer, it becomes bits per second, as I showed in the neuronal case. By using the right units, you can translate that. Then the bits per second goes into instructions per second as you go into hardware and architecture. So the ratio between these two are essentially the translation entropy between two. It's a relative. It is similar informational measures have been used. I think it's called Kullback-Leibler or something like that is used. Kullback-Leibler.
Okay.
Yeah, it is like that, except it is with respect to specific units of computation. So you add them all up, you get the entropy, the so-called computation entropy, and that's what we are. It's the addition of all that. So essentially, now we got this curve, and I think yesterday you asked a question, which is I've been thinking about the question since you asked that. This particular thing is not monotonic because you have all natural systems have zero entropy. By definition, it gets to zero, right? So this is like the 0-point energy of computing. But this particular thing essentially seems to have a very good correlation for one system, if you look at it. You cannot expect all of them to fall universally because there will be a lot of systems here. But each one, if you connect them, they tend to have a good correlation. Now, how can you use the correlation? If I know the correlation, then if I want a system with a certain energy, I know what I should pick off here and try to. That is the way you can use it. Then the second thing is class 7 to class 6 to class 0. Remember, we are going from 0 on general purpose computing into the natural system at class 7. Is essentially showing that it is increasing, but they're not linearly increasing. Orders of magnitude in energy. So this is very useful information to be able to design the system. So I'm just summarizing here, class 0 to class 7 systems go from computing to information processing, what Turing called control to active. Intermediate classes represent different abstractions between these two. And then the computation of an application can be characterized in terms of this entropy. Class 7 systems represent the most energy efficient for a given application, which is computational entropy of 0. Correlation observed, but there is no linear correlation. It's more complicated than that. Systems close to class 7 are most energy efficient. And then John has asked this question, why this hierarchy? I had a lot of discussions before choosing why information basis is bigger knob than architecture, which is bigger knob than hardware. This was your question yesterday. Is this arbitrary? Originally, this was probably started off arbitrary, but then it got consolidated, and let me explain how. Informational basis is whether I'm using the same information as the application. If it's a quantum chemistry, am I using the exact quantum basis for that? Architecture is the plan of how information is conveyed. Hardware is the actual implementation of it. Okay. Now, let us say I'm simulating silicon oxidation. Silicon and oxygen forming silicon dioxide. Even if I have a silicon hardware and I have a classical digital computer, it will be less energy efficient. So this hierarchy is a real hierarchy, qualitative. But if I use the architecture of quantum emulator, like what I showed yesterday, then that has a bigger factor than the exact hardware, whether I use cesium or whether I use francium, radioactive metal, or uranium, is less important than the architecture. The architecture of quantum processing is more important. Information is important because that adds into everything. So that was the point. And then you can actually build a very nice system. So I'm showing state change. So physics of information processing is a state change. It is reduced in terms of microstrate evolution, and then you change your informational basis from analog to digital to quantum or whatever. Now you go to hardware, architecture, and then you go to instruction. That is what these classes are saying. In order to simulate the state 1 to state change, you do all this implicitly when we use a general purpose Neumann computing. Because we are talking about a new way of thinking computing, you can actually go through this flow. So because it's a physical process, but we are actually changing informational basis as we go down. And now, this was the original question that Feynman asked, why should it take an infinite amount of logic to figure out what one tiny bit? And the attempted answer is information processing efficiency is lost as information is abstracted and re-implemented for computing. So we are doing it inefficiently, even though we have very powerful computers. Efficiency is lost at every step from and in natural system in transformation to a different computational basis, in implementation, and finally in computation, where algorithms and software compute. That is the key take-home message. This is why, and this is not unique to computing, it is even computing to the physics models, like the Schrodinger equation versus the Dirac equation. You can go into this, but the point of this is essentially. And I can stop here and we can go shift into Maxwell's Riemann and Landau thing.
But I think you have not addressed one very important area of really doing computing with physics. And that's something that in the last 5 or 6 years has really shown very promising results, in particular from Hugo Ladret, where they were asked to solve Navier-Stokes.
Oh, you're talking about reservoir computing?
Yes.
Yeah, I have addressed it, but I didn't show it.
I see. And then for the rest of the group. And then they built an optical system which actually maps solves the same Navier-Stokes equations, but in optics, and they are able to really get a very efficient implementation.
Yeah,
and so that I think that is really kind of the gist of these ideas.
Oh yeah. I mean, I in fact was in the paper that we are writing up. Reservoir computing is an example, just like quantum computing.
Yes.
And analog computing too. The point is not the specific application. The point is to show the framework trying to address the problem of computing, trying to understand it a little bit more concretely. So your point is well taken, because solar computer is important and it is energy efficient. Sorry, you had a question?
Oh, no. You may follow up on Johanna's question, right? So, in order to quantify efficiency, we also have to quantify the level of abstraction at which the computation is lower, right? So we can have a very efficient implementation of a controller, right, with just a few parameters anywhere or PID, right? Versus one that uses all the synapses that we in the brain.
Right.
So yeah, it can be at level 7 and implement everything very physically, right? But that may not be as efficient as the same PID controller that does the task, right?
Right. So when I say application, application is what decides the rest of it. That is the underlying premise of this. And so I'm assuming there's a real system that does something very efficiently, and we are trying to get as close to it. So you mentioned about proportional integral controller. To me, I would put it in the context of what application is trying to solve. That is the application in which that control would make sense. So the big difference in this formalism is we have flipped it into application first and the rest of the things coming. We generally have grown to a very comfortable position of starting with computing first and then going what application I can solve it with the computing. So all this does is it has flipped everything into an application. Otherwise, you cannot anchor it anywhere.
But I see this approach, but I think this is kind of a bit of I hate to say it, old way of thinking, because modern way of thinking in designing information processing systems starts with a class of problems. There's like the 7 dogs, 17, 18 expansion. So you take this class of problems, and in the future it's going to be even more. And using modern computing, you can actually almost design an application-specific machine, and that is the way information processing is going to be done in the future. Now, with these application-specific machines, some of them are going to be maps from Navier-Stokes to optics, and some are going to be a little bit more programmable. So, to me, it is really about programmability.
Yes.
And a little bit, the degree of programmability rather than the architecture, because the architecture, no matter what, the way we can design hardware, we can build a chip in 1 month, but it's a very sophisticated chip.
1 month. Okay. Well, I worked in 20 years in Intel and Rails.
Yeah, I mean, so.
I mean, you're very optimistic.
At the end, what you want is the physics should match. Right?
That is the point. That is the point.
Yeah.
I mean, none of this is. I mean, this is everything you said. I agree. But the intent of this is a little different. The intent of this is what is the physics in which you are computing? Start with that first, and then try to reframe it from the physics into the computing thing, which is what I was trying to do.
It's fine. Yeah, no.
That is the
it's
point.
fine. Yeah, I mean, these sound very similar to John Doyle's. I've read the QiNS,
Yeah.
layered abstractions. So,
Right.
Yeah, which is. Yeah.
But I think this touches on a very long debate, like, do you want to emulate biology or not, right?
Oh,
So I think
excellent
for
question.
chemistry, I see the point that you're really trying to simulate chemical reactions. If we are taking inspiration from the brain, like everyone typically clarifies that we don't want to one-to-one like simulate all of the.
No, not at all, not at all. So that is where the translational entropy comes in, right? You are willing to give up a lot of the details. Like the question is, when we do neuromorphic thing, do we need to get all the complexity of a single switching into every neuromorphic architecture? The question is, that doesn't serve the purpose of what we are trying to do. So hence it's less applicable. Right? So that's a very good point. Now, I was expecting somebody to ask, oh, would there be any application which doesn't have any footing in nature? So I looked up at the thing which is, to me, the most mathematical thing, was prime numbers. And then there is actually, nature does prime numbers. Certain specific applications of nature. So in a way, this validates because nature has tried all the other pathways. And for every application, it somehow seemed to have figured out through the process of evolution.
So what's the example of nature?
What's the example?
So two examples. One particular example is there is some specific insect in North Carolina, in southeastern part of the United States. These particular species come either at the end of 13th year or at the end of 17th year.
The cicadas,
yeah. And that they argue, to me, that is one of the weaker systems because, why not 11? So, but there is a more compelling explanation why nature does that. Because they have found out that they could train certain mice to do it, and they end up picking prime number, if I have a distribution, is the minimal set in which I could form. I cannot divide it anymore into clusters. So there may be an intrinsic efficiency in prime number.
But we know an example for generating large prime, not small ones, like one, but is there a natural process?
No, I looked up, even as late as 2019, people are debating about it. But so my point is, let's take some example. All I wanted to show was almost every example you can get close to the application. Jonas mentioned something on biology and chemistry, but fluid flow, it does not have biology in it, doesn't have chemistry in it. The reservoir computing is trying to do that by having a response system. The thing about the reservoir computing is they have shown with Lorentz attractors and things like that, chaotic systems, and I have seen this and the results are impressive. But each fluid system has different scaling. Right? What if it doesn't scale with Reynolds number? It scales with some other number. Then your reservoir should capture that. So even within the system, the class being very close to the physics you are solving, all this whole framework and the numbering has shown just one message. Stay close to the physics or to the nature in your computing as much as possible. If you were to pick a priority or a hierarchy, pick the same informational basis as the application. If not, pick the architecture close to the application, neuromorphic. If you can't do both, at least try to pick the hardware, wetware, to do the computation. That's what this is.
No, just devil's advocate, I want to say this. So in the neuromorphic community, some people might criticize that we are already doing this too much, so that people say the same information basis. Okay, so everything has to be done with spikes. Architecture next, so everything has to be spiking neurons. Even in the end, we end up with something that doesn't seem to be necessarily more efficient.
Yes, I know. I know, your point is well taken, because what we do is once we have it, we tend to generalize that to every problem. Like we are trying to move, even in our working group, we are trying to into spike networks, right? Spike neural network. So we now want to generalize it. Whenever you are generalizing, you are going up. When you are specializing, you are coming down. I'm not saying anything what dozens of Turing winners have said, but I have just quantified it and put it in a more sound, physically based way of thinking about it. So we can think about it more intelligently when we try to design this. That's the point. Yes.
How much energy is wasted in biological process when it tries to solve like a body control or human language process, right? It's probably that it's not optimal to do that. Biology does that because couldn't find it any other way. It had to work with this.
Right. So
it is possible. Do you think there's a framework?
So I have had this discussion with biologists and physicists, and I will tell you their answer, and I kind of buy the argument. Nature does not have one optimal solution. Second of all, there is no upper amount of level of complexity. Complexity is relatively easier than energy for nature. It can bring as much complexity as it wants, but it just cannot bring energy, because then you won't survive. And I have plotted systems and microprocessors on the same graph, and microprocessor will not survive evolution, even the most efficient, if you let it. If you assume that you let it, and I have done this for robotics, Boston Dynamics robots, I have looked at the size, then the material and energy. You come back, this conclusion keeps getting reinforced. I didn't show any of that because they don't add it to anything that I'm saying. No, they all reinforce each other. Okay? Anything man-made seems to be faster and more powerful, less energy efficient and less material efficient. That is, so nature on the other hand uses a given set of materials, but incredible amount of complexity, but low energy operation. So there's no one optimal solution. Your circumstances will determine what is the nature's most optimal solution under those conditions, right? For example, in turbulence, you have very distinct time scales in laminar flow and fluids. Once you go to turbulence, you get power spectrum. So you essentially have like a power law. Why? Because all kind of oscillators break out. Because your energy is increasing. How do you get to turbulence? You get to turbulence because your velocity is going up. The Reynolds number goes above a number, which means you have more and more energy being put into the system. So it rearranges the system by putting a lot of local oscillators there, because that is one way of putting contained systems. I mean, you look at all the chaotic systems, they reach chaos by period doubling. More and more periods happen. That is the way it handles it. See, it added complexity when you added energy. When you took away energy, it was able to reduce. That's, I mean, whether it's a living being or non-living, it seems to be the same concept.
When you talk about natural computation, do you suppose that we already what is going on with how nature computes?
Well, if going by this discussion today, right? If I come up with a number of 10, you may argue that you like 12 better. So in other words, we have the formalism, but we don't have the numbers. Quantification is the problem. Not the, well, why can't we quantify it? Because you don't understand all the microstates and the microprocesses.
But when you look at a physical system, do you then fit a Turing machine to it? Do you fit a reservoir computing framework to it? I mean, we come and we bring our own idea of what a computation is, and then we look for it in a physical system. Right. And we can match a Turing machine to it, we can match a reservoir system to it, we can also find spikes in it maybe. So I mean, there's different ways of
So,
looking at it.
there is some universality in which how these things are done, right? As I was just saying, period doubling way to chaos is considered one of the most universal ways to turbulence in liquid systems. And there are homoclinic orbits, but they all have period doubling happening. So intrinsically, let's take our neural network. We also have periods in it. Look at your qubit; those also have periods. That's what Rahul was talking about. He put together a capacitor called Planck capacitor, just trying to mimic the quantum system. So in other words, our mathematical ideas are reasonably sound. The framework is what I am trying to bring to it. In addition, I am trying to show by examples that you can quantify. And when you quantify it, rather than it becoming an argument about, oh, this computing is better than others, it comes an argument of those numbers versus these numbers, right? So it becomes a more specialized and specific argument once you put it out on a very systematic framework. So,
yeah, but I think, yes, to answer your question, I think there is a framework, and that is, in my viewpoint, there is a framework of information communication theory that will allow you to actually do what you want to do. And if you want to talk about that, I'll give you a little tutorial later on the board. So there is a fundamental formula that allows you to really do that. If you really want to do synthesis, also analysis that allows you to get fundamental limits, because information theory will allow you to get fundamental limits, but also paths. It allows you to give you paths to synthesis. And I think that is really finding there is no universal synthesis theory for the world, but there is systematic ways, information communication theory, how to evaluate possible candidate solutions, architectures to the problem. I mean, that's basically.
Andreas, you will give another lecture.
I'll give a talk on that. I mean, I'm happy to really next week or sometime give a talk on really making this point. And just to a little preview. I mean, this is work that we did about 25 years ago. And the goal of that work is to understand low-fly photoreceptor. Take low-fly photoreceptor, we know the measured bit rate, fundamental bit rate through the photoreceptor, the spectral intensity. Understand why do we measure that bit rate in the blood line, a really very fundamental process. And so from that, after we understood that, then we could go and give you a synthetic approach to really address various other problems. But that's my belief. I mean, that's my viewpoint, and there's many other viewpoints. Time only will show which remains alive.
how are we doing on the time?
Yeah, that's a question. So because it would be great if we can get to the point of your energy efficient computing.
Well, do you want? Okay.
I mean, this
This is probably more.
Well past the end, so.
I can stop now, and if you want, you can pick that up. But I do have.
But we'll go straight to lunch, so I think we do, yeah, so. No, you
Oh.
go ahead.
Unless we can schedule like a more complete session later, maybe.
Possibility, so how much more would you like to show? I mean.
There is a whole topic that I know Gert loves, Maxwell's Riemann Landau, and something to connect with something like that. We can discuss it maybe in a working group. How to apply it to systems, how to apply Landau to systems. You showed how it can be applied to some processing. We have done work in which applying it to large systems. The same type of analysis, but a large system.
We're getting to come to the answer.
Right.
So that
Would that be interesting? That should be on the.
So I'll have to time to discuss it because I think it's a stupid bridge thing. I think it would be a shame to just run it through the final.
Yes, so do you want to take a break now and then try again after?
I'm available here till I have to be. Leave for the day. I'm available anytime you want to.
Take more time because then we can also discuss a bit more.
Absolutely. So your questions, I think every question, I write them down.
Yeah, just.
We can try to this one offline, then we can see if
Let me know. I can stay as much as you want. Because there is so much interesting thing on Landau limit.
Yes.
I know where to louse this back. So because it goes to the underlying thermodynamics of computing, which I didn't go into here. And then also how the Department of Energy is actually using some of this analysis, setting up their roadmap on energy efficiency. That's what the next few slides are. I don't want to. Reversible computing is one of the answers, and that comes in the thermodynamics, and I will essentially show, maybe I can tell you this now. You don't need reversible logic to have adiabatic computing. Assuming adiabatic is energy efficient. I'm sure by concocted computing systems that you can have very low energy using computing. Even the gate is still reversible using NAND gate and NOR gates. You can still do it. You don't need to go to Toffoli's gates or any of them. You can break the energy efficiency from logic reversibility. You can do it through logic reversibility too, then you are bringing it closer to physics, which I argued before. But here I am arguing that you would break them apart and implement it on the current architecture. In fact, I had almost convinced the Intel people that we should pursue this. I've gotten almost the budget, but it just didn't click at that time, so before I left.
The idea is to have a closed loop system of in vitro neurons, so neuron on a chip, we could say, or on a dish, that are learning how to play Pong through a closed loop system in which basically, so like you can see, just like the real-time kind of thing, where the neurons get an electrical stimulation that is going to encode the position of the ball in that space, and then they'll get some sort of feedback, which we're going to talk about in later slides, which allows them to understand what's going on in that environment and to play this simple game. It's really a super cool paper. It's very complete, it's very complex as well, so interrupt me anytime. The idea is that it's going to be a bunch of human or mouse neurons that are going to be cultivated. I'll skip over the biological details. If you have any more questions, like do ask them. The idea for human neurons is that you take like skin cell, you add some sort of viral vector, and then you reconvert them back to neuron. It's called induced pluripotent stem cell technologies. And for the mouse neuron, there's like a different pipeline to get. So that one we talked about. So yes, I went through with that one. The thing is that you have to remember this is an in vitro setup. It's not going to be exactly the same as you would have when you record cortical neurons. So like neurons, they'll look mostly like this. They form through what's called chemotactism. They like attract together and they form these clumps of cells. Oh, there's like a 5-second delay on my slideshow. Yeah, it's really different from like the well-defined cortical anatomy that you would see in I guess EEG or like also the monkey data that we're going to have access to for this project. So what's going to happen is that they put this neuron in culture, they put it on this multi-electrode array that you can see in the false contrast in red in the back. And the setup is that it's a commercially available Maxwell array. It's made in Switzerland. It's 26K electrodes, but due to the fact that it's closed loop and real time, they only record for 2 to the power of 10 electrodes at 20 kilohertz, which is more than enough to get some interesting data. It's only a limited subsample of electrodes because, so like this is what it's going to look like. The data that we have access to, you see it's different. Yes. It's different channel numbers recorded over 20-minute sessions, I think 20-minute sessions, right? And the reason is that it's only recorded over 1,024 electrodes is that there's a particular setup to it makes sense, like it's organized the way it's going to be in the future slide. It's going to be organized in a sensory region that's going to be about 600 electrodes, which is going to encode the position of the ball inside the environment, and then 2 motor regions which are going to control the up-down position of the Pong paddle.
And how many electrodes are being stimulated?
Pardon?
How many electrodes are stimulated?
There's like 8. There's like 8 predefined regions. This is the layout schematic. Yes.
So we also record not only the motor area, but also the sensory.
You record everything, right? It's both stimulating and recording, right? So in the paper, there's a bunch of different layouts that they tried, and in the end, they settled for this one. We'll go into that details later. The idea is that you have the sensory area, which is at the top of the flipped image previously, which has like 8 electrodes that encode the position of the ball inside the environment, and then 2 motor regions at the bottom that are controlling the up-down position of the paddle. The whole setup is like this. Maybe I don't dive into the particular detail because it might not be relevant to the project. Basically, the idea is that you have like the multi-electrode array connected through a commercially available setup, and this is like kind of the whole brand new development of the paper, where you record the voltage, you spike threshold them, they go to the Pong environment and just goes into closed loop to make stimulations.
Sorry, the question of electrode row, this schematic on the top or the electrode row, there are numbers there. What do those numbers mean? Because they don't add up to 1,000, right?
No, because like it's a 26K electrode, but they only record to 1,000. Well, I guess it's not like right, because that could be like a 15 by next time. I don't know, it might be up to scale actually. Yeah. So it's that it's like 20K electrodes that only record from less than that. Okay. Do you have also the possibility to record from the other and you just didn't, or?
Yeah, so the possibility, yes, but like I think that afterwards the data would be like just
it's not really close to that. Cool, right. So there's 2 points that I want to explain in this article. It's A, how does the sensory area work, and B, how does the motor region work? Rather straightforward, but we have to go through it. The idea of how the ball is located in the environment is that they adapted after trial and error. I guess there were a few prototypes, a kind of place cell coding, where you have a continuous firing rate, which tells to these 8 simulation electrodes, just it's a place encoding basically. The idea is that it looks something like this. This would be an example of a place cell coding. This is recorded in a rat hippocampus, and you see in red the discharge pattern when the rat's moving through the environment. And so really the way they justify it in the article, they say, well, it works that way in the hippocampus. So like any kind of self-organizing neural network should be able to work on that kind of encoding. And they were right, because that works in the paper. And so it's the idea that through the firing rate, the continuous firing rate of a neuron, whenever there's an object, here it's a self-object, so it's a rat that moves in the environment, you're going to have like a sort of kernel density of the firing rate that maps firing rate to position in the environment. And basically the idea is that the ball is located via place coding on a range of 4 to 40 hertz. And then there's the fact of how the neuron controls the paddles. And for that one, it's rather simple. They have a bunch of different configurations that they scan through to optimize, basically to have optimal control of the Dishbrain over these motors layout. And it's a really simple rate field. Like the more the neuron fire, the more it's going to push either up or down. One important point that Simon mentioned yesterday is that left and right motor region, they're not like encoding the left-right paddle. It's just really one paddle, and it automatically bounces off the opposite wall in that game environment. And so I guess it's just brilliant, like to have a one-to-one out map.
I actually have a question about this. Why do you separate the regions into 2 like redundant areas?
Yeah, that's I think Hugo was just mentioning try to logic in layouts. One of them was just, for example, right hand side would be just up, the left hand side just down, and then this layout would be best.
Results, we choose one. Okay,
just one best.
But what was the reason not to have like one left, one right? Simple.
This layout performed better.
Oh, it's not like for ideas of non-linearities or whatever, just trying to.
And maybe we could say that, so basically these motor or sensory regions are predefined by us, like we obviously don't have motor neurons there and sensory neurons there. So maybe this kind of modeling, the fact that we don't have like motor neurons that are just reacting to the going off on this part and then the other, or this, because there's no really distinguished population of neurons here, right? All of them can be involved in the game or interconnected with each other and we have complex roles, so react to the thing and all of that. So apparently this layout is how they are performing best.
So in that idea, is the layout implicitly made with the idea that you're going to have a sensory motor split? And in that sense, have you also try like to have a sort of sensory motor interweave with the layout, like you would have stimulation next to control, and then we just make kind of a mosaic kind of thing?
Like motor regions and sensory units, all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I don't think it's right that layout. We wanted to keep them separate, and for a lot of analysis, we kind of don't work on the middle channels, which are, but for some analysis, we also use those.
Okay.
But in all of the layers that we tried, the sensory and motor regions were actually separate.
Right.
Defined to be separate.
If you repeat the experiment with times and which configuration?
Yeah.
How much?
How many times?
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know the number, but a lot of times. You can see the intermediate or the performance and then choose the best. And try it on different cultures. Obviously, not just one culture, not multiple trials, but different cultures and all of them trials.
And then there's the idea that all of that mixes together. They have a very nice visualization software that you can access online. The idea is that like, so that all mixes together, right? You have the sensory input in the bottom and the motor region in the top. And you have like the live state of the environment on the top right of that video. It's just basically repeating what I said, right? And so this would be like the pattern of spikes. The contrast is not great, but you can see like the height of each single electrode represent the amounts of spike emitted by the neurons recording.
Sorry, was this a simulation or actual data?
This is actual data, right? Yeah, this is actual data. So yeah, how I was hoping that it would be like, it's much more bright on my screen, so we can't really exactly see what's going on. What basically you should have seen right now, yeah, is that whenever there's a hit on the Pong paddle, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a coherent kind of feedback where all the 8 electrodes in the sensory area are going to get a coherent, predictable kind of discharge. This works like, if you remember the introduction, if you remember what we showed you like in the previous slide, basically the way the recordings are working, this is a figure from the paper, is something like that, where here you have the electrons number and like this is 100 seconds of time of the gameplay. What's going to be delivered in terms of discharge to the sensory region when it's in the phase, like when it's blue, it's a sensory, so it's the place coding that I just talked about that tells you the position of the ball in the game environment. If the paddle managed to hit right the ball, it gets a predictable feedback. There is a coherent kind of discharge onto the sensory region. Failing that, if it's a miss, it gets a pink random discharge, which you can see here, that creates a non-coherent and predictable kind of activity, followed by 4 seconds of shutdown, and then this is randomly initialized. So what you would see like right now, it's super cool. It's like in vitro neurons manage to hit the ball with the paddle 5 times in a row. That's so cool.
So it's basically punished with like
yeah, it's punished with randomness and rewarded with predictability. And it all works because there's a predictable feedback. So like I don't present it, but in the paper there are like a bunch of different conditions where there's no feedback, there's silent feedback, there's continuous event stream. Basically, it only works when you have predictable feedback. And that predictable feedback, the entire idea is that in the article, it's also a bit of it is written by Carl Christian, so it's free energy principle based. in the idea that the model, be them actual brain or just brain dishes, they work on the prediction error kind of dynamics, in which it is so hard to have like constant stream of words, in which you try to minimize the free energy in the system by optimizing for prediction. This is the free energy principle. You want to minimize the error of your model by minimizing the surprise by making prediction. And in that specific case, it's like a closed loop environment where there are motor region, which is called the active inference under the free energy principle. It's basically the same, but just you hardwire a Pong paddle to the model, and then you can also minimize the error and the surprise by both making better predictions and changing the state of the. And so in that particular case, what it would look like is that you have like the topmost sensory region that can encode the state of the world and the prediction error based on the feedback it gets in that closed loop environment. And at the bottom region would be the active part of the inference, where you can control the pattern. And I think that's what's really neat, because when you think of it, the only learning rule there is in that game is that the network gets reinforced when it gets like a predictable kind of activity, which theoretically should work based on the free energy principle. And that's a demonstration that it actually works without kind of complicated political architecture with reward system, with dopamines, with temporal difference learning, all that kind of stuff. It's just so amazing, that thing. All right, that was just like for the introduction of the article. I'll just go pretty quickly into the results right now. So the idea is that like there's going to be a bunch of metric on the game of Pong. I did not grow up playing Pong, so I don't really know the lingo. I played World of Warcraft. It's far complicated. There's like two terms to know in Pong lingo. There's this, which is called an ace. That's basically you fail to intercept on serve. And there this, which is called a rally, that's basically hitting the ball. And once you hit once, it counts as a rally. There's also the metric of the rally length, that is like how many like times you exchange back and forth the ball. And more than 3 times would be considered a long rally in the paper. And they just also count the amount of long rally. The results are shown here. So this is like the average rally length, how many times the ball has been exchanged back and forth. These are controls, so just like the gross medium, random control of the paddle, and this is without gameplay for the first 5 minutes and for the rest of the 15 minutes, basically. So like you see all the control, there's, lost my mouse. There is no, there we go. There is no change. Of course, there's absolutely no learning going on in the control. This is a mouse cell, and this is human cells. So you can see there's a significant, very significant increment in the average rally length after only 5 minutes of learning, which is super impressive. It's faster than learning, I want to say on the CPU, but maybe on the GPU. How fast is it like to get better performance with RL?
For the point, it would be quite.
Yeah, it's not a very complex game.
But you've actually done that. It's a new paper start. I'm going to start present that on Wednesday. It's important to know that for the comparison to be fair, we're not talking about time.
Exactly.
So what we keep saying is the number of episodes that they've been trained on compared to others, they're much better.
To know not in minutes, but in trials.
Yeah.
It's equivalent to an average number of 70.
70 trials.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very good choice.
And one thing that was really interesting, you like see how in the first 5 minutes, human cells are actually worse at doing this than the mouse are, which in the paper they suggest is the idea that human cells need like more initial exploration kind of thing, but then have a richer dynamic going on at the end. Is that really the case, or is it maybe artifactual? Yeah, it's a great hypothesis. All right. It works the same with the number of aces, that is how many times the paddle failed to intercept the ball on serve, so it diminishes significantly after 5 minutes of learning. And same, the number of like the percentage of very long rally also increases like by a massive amount. These are very impressive results, I think. And then what's happening is that they also correlate, like back to the electron layout schematic, they correlate the firing rate, in the sensory region with the motor region one, which would be the top action. So you see like there's a very nice clear correlation during rest for both motor region, and it's a correlation that is also going on during gameplay, suggesting that there's an effective connectivity going on between these inputs and outputs of the Dishbrain. And then the average, like the cross correlation, which I don't show the metric, but it's not that complicated. The average sensory motor cross correlation, you can see that it is really increased during gameplay phases for both the up and down region compared to no gameplay. Same as with the general firing rates of the neuron when they are resting or engaging in gameplay, suggesting that there's really an engaging of the firing rate going on right here. There's like a bunch of other figures in that paper that I don't really present because it's very interesting. I invite you to read it, but I don't think it's relevant to the modeling project. Basically, the idea is of these papers that like really individual where you can solve very, I would say very complex tasks of reinforcement learning, which was a really nice to see. There's now maybe now you are going to present us like a bit of code and data. If you are on the Slack channel, I also uploaded a collab notebook of the data that's available with the article, but it's mostly post-processed already data, so it's just interesting to reproduce the feature and show that it's not pure Photoshop, but otherwise it's not. Anyways. So should we go on this computer or do you go on Zoom?
Yeah, I'm trying to now.
Also, I'll start.
Very quick question. The sensory input, it is relative to the pattern, right? It's like positional encoding when you give it is.
So, for example, the closer the ball is to the pattern, the higher the frequency.
It's from 4 to 40 hertz.
Yeah.
And up down is relative, right? So,
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
But it's not like the absolute encoding of the y-axis position. It's like
Y-axis is just between those 8 electrodes.
right.
Oh,
okay.
So very rough location in terms of y-axis. So only one of the stimulus electrodes is active at each one, and it shows which basically segments on the y-axis the ball is.
These electrodes are two-dimensional. One's the y-axis of the ball, position of the y-axis. Is the segment.
One of the 8 electrodes.
And the x-axis is related to the rate coded of the frequency. And the network has no idea what the wall potential. That information it does not know. The network does not know where the walls are.
Oh, where the walls are. No,
it doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
Otherwise, get the legend.
Okay, so I am in the room. Okay, now.
I mean, there is no sensory input for the distance. There is no sensory information about the distance.
No.
Just the position.
So the electrodes were in various position information theory. To apply the reward signal, they're getting the pattern from the same base electrodes.
Yes. Yeah.
Pause in the simulation, reward, do another round.
Exactly.
So in that line, is the reward only on the 8 electrodes or also deliver on the motor?
No, only 8. So other than those electrodes, no input is applied.
Right. Oh, even like when there's the period going on, the motor region.
So they can hear you, right? So we can. So could
I think like the microphone is fine.
Just before doing that, so I'm just gonna briefly tell you what type of data we have on the contrary here, because on Wednesday start and Wednesday afternoon, but Hugo made our job much easier, so he went through a lot of the stuff already.
People, I think you need to go through for everyone else.
That's great, but yeah, obviously we go through the background, some of the results, some of the projects we've done. We have 2 more papers coming out hopefully very soon. us, but Hugo Simon mentioned that it would be nice to just have a feeling of the data today and maybe share them on Google Drive, a couple of them. And also we can share some like basic scripts with you just to read the files and all of that. But just to talk about the files now, you are basically seeing my private branch of Jupyter Park from Cortical Labs. Our recordings, like the very raw files that we've worked on a lot of projects, are binary files. So binary files are basically recording the channel IDs in bits, then the frame on which each channel had a spike, again in another byte, and then all of that. But then processed one more level to just make it more user friendly. So I think even this audience would be much happier with that. Are H5 files. These are hierarchical basically files to store the data in, and these are what we're going to share with you. You have all sorts of information in these files, like the version of the software we're using, the for example, the game that we're using in that recording, the date of the recording, the chip ID, and all of that. But the code I'm going to share with you is basically extracting the ID and the information about the chip, because you want to be able to distinguish between different recordings, and then the location of all the electrodes that we have, like in X and Y actual coordinates, in case you're interested in some physical analysis of the location, and then also the amplitude of the signal, which most of the projects might not be very interested in that, but then also the spikes which are detected already in the Dishbrain system. We have a spike detection, spike sorting algorithm implemented. We are also blind for the signals, the stimulus signals, clean data a bit more. So you'll have access to channel IDs, and then for each channel, the frame numbers, frame is the time basically, in which that channel spiked or the action potentials were recorded. And then from then you can have, I don't know, the firing rates, you can have interspike intervals, anything. And then basically associated with each H5 file, you'll also have a text file, which is an events file. Just a feeling of how that one looks. H5 file, obviously I can't open here on text just to show you, but event files, for example, this is a gameplay event file. Oh, I'm not sharing this screen. Okay. Okay. For example, this is going to be this is an event file. Basically, in the H5 file, you have information about the spikes, action potentials, and the recordings, amplitudes, and all of that. But then to know what's actually happening in the game environment, you'll have to look at the events file. So again, here you have a bunch of information which might not be interested, like when the recording was done, where it's being stored and all of that on our system. But then one line which would be interesting to you is this line, because if this is a recording of a gameplay, you'll have full game here. But if this is a recording of rest, just a spontaneous activity, you'll have rest here. But then the structure of the file is exactly the same. Both have H5 files associated with them and all of that. So from here, you'll know if it's a gameplay or if it's a rest file.
Sorry, just a question. What's the signification of experimental type as well?
Experimental. Oh, we have so many different tags that we've tested on, different types of cells, like engine 2 we have. I'm not sharing any engine 2 with you, but this is basically how Brett has coded the name of that experiment, depending on what he's been using.
Right.
I think I'm sharing all of the same tags.
Oh, yeah.
No difference in terms of the game or the culture. And then these are good. The duration is in seconds, so 20 minutes would be 1200 here, and then here is where the game begins. These numbers are basically the time, but it's the system's clock, so you know that the sampling frequency is 20K. So it will be easy enough to know, for example, the time it took for the ball to bounce and then bounce again and then we return. So because you know the sampling frequency.
To the sample frequency.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And then, well, I think the rest is quite obvious. Ball bounce is bouncing off the balls. So that's like an event we're very interested in. But then ball return is actually when the paddle hits the ball. So it's a rally. And then again, a lot of bounces here. And then miss is the end of each rally. It's the first time that the ball was missed. And then everything that Hugo just explained is going to happen. We're going to give them the feedback. And then 4 seconds like pause. And then the next game is going to begin. And then you have all these events until the very end. Yeah.
So what is the motor layout?
Motor it's the layout that we use in the paper. So up, up, down, down. So because we have recordings of all the layouts in the events file, we also record that. But everything in the paper is motor layout 0, and all of the shape that we have in the paper.
I think that's an idea. It's always the predictable feedback condition. You're not giving us the silent or
and these, the ones that I'm sharing with you are predictable. Yeah. Yeah.
So when the ball is missed, it looks like you've got 2 timestamps that are identical, so you froze it in the simulation. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, motor layout 0 is just kind of an info that you maybe want to use in the future with other layouts. Okay, so going back to the other screen. So yeah, very briefly, you have H5 files and the events file that I just showed you. And then what we've selected so far is like, it's going to be 5 gameplay sessions and 4 sessions, I guess I have in this folder, just a random number. And then, well, I'm going to run this here, but I'll need to, I'm going to have to share the codes with you. These are just customized functions that we've written ourselves. Basically, to make everything easier, you'll have a function to read the H5 file and extract the info. So it's going to look like something like, so this function works on all the files in the folder. So the data frame you'll get is just concatenated for all the files. If you want to just work with one file, obviously you can just select that. So you're going to have a lot of rows because H5 files, for each action potential that is recorded, you're going to get a row. Each action potential is on each channel. So that's just so many. But you see, for example, for chip number 11614 in this particular date and session number, I'm going to tell you about session number now. For example, channel 953 has spikes on frame number 8575. And then you have also the exact coordinates of the channel in X and Y. And then the amplitude wouldn't be really interesting. I'm not sure about your projects, to be honest, but if you're interested in the spike trains.
We'll be talking about it later.
Yeah,
sure. See what the data was.
Yeah. And then, as I told you, you're going to have a lot of rows for each of the action potentials that are recorded on each channel. But then again, we already have a function that kind of cleans up stuff. So for each ID is basically chip ID, session, and day. For each recording of 20 minutes, you will have this dictionary for which just sorting that for each channel, you're going to have the number, the frame numbers where the action potential was recorded. So this is going to be a dictionary with all the channels, channel 0 to channel 10 to 23, with the corresponding frame numbers where the action potentials happens. And these, you don't mind these are not related to this file. Session number I wanted to talk to you about. So basically our recordings, we identify them with chip ID, basically the ID of the actual Maxwell chip that we're using, the date of the recording, because we may be recording one chip in different days. And then session is for each chip, normally what we do is that we record a gameplay session, which is number 0. Then we record rest, which is number 1. Again, gameplay number 2, rest number 3, gameplay number 4. So just as a very easy rule, the odd numbers would be rest, even numbers including 0 would be gameplay. But again, the event file specifically tells you what type of recording that is if you forget. But like in the code, that's what we've used to just differentiate between the rest and gameplay. So here I just easily select the active or gameplay sessions and rest session based on their session number. And then again, we have another function. You might not even be interested in these, but these are already implemented. It's a function that gives you a lot of stats about the firing rate, spike boards. The spike boards are basically for your specified time being size. You just count and calculate all the spikes that have happened in that time being. And this function does that for each channel. And then also calculates the firing rate for each channel based on the bin size, which is here in seconds that you give to specify. It gives you the mean firing rate for each channel, mean firing rate for all the culture, variance, maximum firing rate, inter-spike intervals, and all those sort of stats. But again, when you have the file yourself, you basically have access to all of the action potentials on all of the channels, and also the event file, when the ball is hit and when the ball is missed. And I'm hoping that would be probably enough for most of the projects you have in mind. And like maybe after this session, what I'll be sharing with you is the files and also these functions. These are .py functions that you can just import. I think you only need these 3. I'll share them with you, and yeah, you just store them in your own folder, and then from them, all of these functions should be working okay for you. And maybe one metric you can try to just extract for yourself, just to start, playing around with the file, is hit to miss ratio. In my own opinion, we haven't chosen a really good name for this measure. It's basically a metric of game performance, but it's not the ratio between hit balls to miss balls. It's basically the ratio of the accurate hits to the total number of times the ball, has reached the paddle, either missed or hit. So basically, because it means more than half of the times the ball was hit. The higher the number, the better. So these are just roughly the numbers for these 5 cultures that I've chosen. These are gameplay, and these are rest.
Sorry, stupid question regarding the game environment. Whenever the ball misses and you reinitialize the simulation, it's a random vector, right? It's not always the same position and the same vector that's applied to the.
No, the punishment is random.
Right, but the vector, the vector of the ball, like the trajectory of the ball in the environment, it's random.
The initiation, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Right, yeah, correct. It's random. Yeah, I guess that was all in terms of data and code, and I'll get the Google Drive. I think we share it on Slack. We have a link. I'll find it and share it away. Dishbrain. Yeah. Yeah, I can share all of these with you, and we're more than happy to hear about the ideas you have about projects, and then any questions. And on Wednesday, we'll have obviously a lot more time to talk again.
So here's a question. As you go further into the settings, I assume that we go on to 3. Is that you see improvement in this ratio, or is that smaller chunks?
No, we don't. Yeah, so we haven't been able to identify like kind of a memory in these cultures yet.
There are memory lists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Each session.
Yeah.
So, no, I thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you start with something that completely sucks, and then it gets better throughout that single session?
Yes.
Very
Yes. So average rally length, for example, increases, and the percentage of aces decreases, number of long rallies.
This is like you're recording new culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good, because then we can see the evolution of the system over time in a mental level around how it's adapting. Yeah, see, as you know, this is good. This is really good.
Just one detail, we were kidding about take pictures when you show environment. The meeting's actually recorded, so you want us to go ask.
Yeah, no, it's so awkward. You just saw some folder names of file names. Yeah, me too.
Uranium enrichment.pptx was not like.
No, that's all good. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
So I will present a few initial ideas that we have of this project. Yeah. So our initial idea So we have this question like, can we create a good enough software approximation of Dishbrain, in order to be able to simulate other environments like products, the cells, etc., which might be difficult to reproduce in academic environments. So yeah, can we have a simulation that approximates what has been recorded yet on the Dishbrain? And for that, yeah, you would need to create a digital twin of the system.
It's out of business.
So that's
Want to buy us for open
the fundamental question is that there has been a few neuron types developed in the last years, and they have been tested and seen whether they were replicating cortical activity, etc. If you think about the Hodgkin-Oxler model or the LIF model, etc. The question is, how do these neuron types behave in a very dynamic system containing a lot of cells, and whether this replicates the activity that is seen in this brain. So we plan to evaluate a few different neuron types, starting with common deep learning techniques, and then testing other implementations and other learning groups. And then, if we have the time, the goal would be to deploy these systems on the Spinnaker to take advantage of the acceleration.
So one off the cuff thought is that if you're using backprop, is this sequence of each section is not pretty damn long. So you have to backprop again, unless you're binning a bunch of data.
Yeah, I guess we.
I mean, you could bin it, but then keep in mind something that I feel like in your also got that truncated backprop every time.
Yeah, we still have to figure out if we use like diffusion with backprop or if we put it like brain. I assume the distribution of the spectrum will evolve in time, depending on where we are in the session. So it's also one thing that we have to investigate with. So the neural architecture would be quite simple. So just provide the positional encoding of the power of the ball of time t, and try to predict probability of the brain, the Dishbrain, just after that. And then we still have to figure out what type of loss function we want to use. A1 between events. The training strategy. So we will go in probably in that order, with increasing complexity from deep learning technique towards reinforcement learning and more biologically plausible learning routes. And if we go up, in fact, we would have potentially fastest or more. It has to be explored. So the outcomes of the project would be a tool that can simulate Dishbrain, potentially open source, and potentially with multiple level of complexity. If we want a very fast, just an insight, we can use a very simple model, and then we increase the complexity to have more accurate representation. From the research aspect, we could use the simulator to check how the Dishbrain will react to another task and maybe get insights about the learning process. Probably STP or RSTP are not exactly what is happening in the Dishbrain solution, so we can explore a bit of that. Finally, on the hardware implementation side, we could implement one or multiple neural models in Spinnaker and measure the efficiency and accuracy of Dishbrain on Spinnaker 2. And this would provide also some insight about the efficiency of Dishbrain with respect to on-silicon solution. Yeah, we have the agenda. So first week would be exploring, training a few first models, and then the second week we will implement potentially the thing called Spinnaker. Many of these tasks can be done simultaneously, but here I'll just put like what would be the focus each day, what would be the priority. So we have a lot of tasks. For the moment, we are 3 projects, Hanley, Hugo, and myself. We have distributed these following tasks. Like this, maybe if you are interested in joining us and helping us with this project, you're welcome to participate. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah, really rigorous.